Wrapping up that hour of music was Elevators by Kevin MacLeod. Agents, big or small, male or female, you are listening, and we are listening to WCEU, the Interagency Radio. Due to some budget cuts out of the Clinton administration, we're going to have to start reading ads out here, but luckily there are a number of great products designed for all you agents out in the field and at home that hopefully you'll be interested in buying after hearing it here on your radio station. Dating in this new century can be a real challenge. It's hard to remember the likes and interests of every new person you come across, which can make honest and meaningful connections almost impossible to obtain. Much like those sources we're all looking for. But now there's a solution, and one that embraces the digital age to enhance the personal relationships in your life. Introducing the Prior Romantic Observational Memory Integration System, a new software for a new era. Our bleeding-edge technology here at the Bureau allows you to feed important personal data about the important persons in your life into our ACCRUAL or accrual system. From there, it is then analyzed, cataloged, compartmentalized, redistributed, utilized, actioned, and loaded into the master system. Upon completion of that process, our team of experts take the data and information obtained from your valuable input and send it back to you in a compact, easy-to-understand text file, safely stored on a generic, unmarked USB stick. Just plug it into your computer and let the learning begin. Thanks to the successful work of people like you, our database is growing exponentially every day. Now, whenever someone new catches your eye, you can enter their name, phone number, address, or date of birth into our website and learn everything you need to know about them to make your first date an unforgettable one. That's the promise we stand by. Well, I don't know about any of you listeners out there, but I know that if my marriage goes belly up, I know where I'm going to turn. To gain access to the accrual system, all you have to do is file an interagency memo, send it off to the NSA, and you will be on your way. All right, everybody. Starting off this next hour of radio is every agent's favorite Kevin MacLeod with Spasmatic Polka. Keeping that royalty-free music rolling here on WECU. We are listening. You are listening to the only interagency radio possible within these United States. Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
My name is Cody.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Will.
And this week we are going to be continuing our discussions on Bleeding Edge, specifically chapters 10, 11, and 12 of Bleeding Edge. Which are some of the most exhausting research-heavy chapters I think we've had since we started doing this podcast. So I'm sure that we'll get into all of that. But for all of you listening at home, there are a lot of references in here to real-life things that have a significant amount of history behind them. But without further ado, what were your guys' general thoughts on these chapters?
I thought they were good, not my favorite section so far. The last round that we did, 7 through 9, I thought, as far as from a pure reading enjoyment standpoint, were the most entertaining up to this point. These chapters I thought were good in the amount of information given. Specifically, as you mentioned, the just deluge of facts that are kind of buried and nestled in here regarding all kinds of interesting history. Specifically, there's a lot to do with spying and espionage, and the use of all of that through the American government. So it is easy to get lost in a back and forth between reading and finding something, like looking something up online and getting lost in doing that, which I found myself doing a couple of times, and I had to finally just like stop doing that and just kind of take what knowledge I already had and kind of use that, because otherwise I would not have been finished in time for this week's episode. So it's it's one of the, like, I think it reminds me again of why it's so bothersome that this book is so underappreciated, because there really is so much to pull out of here, and these chapters are a really good example. You know, the people who are really into like Gravity's Rainbow and all of the references that are buried into that book, there's just as much in here. Like, there is a lot going on that is not being, you know, explicitly explained on the page, but is there for you to go and look up and add that that context to your reading.
Yeah, that's for sure. I ended up having to read the chapters twice, because partway through chapter 10, I think I had a visceral reaction of, well, I gotta fucking look this up now. And then I was like, you know what? I'm gonna just read through these chapters, and I'm gonna go back through them a second time, and that's what I'm gonna do all of the research stuff that I need to do. But yeah, I really like it a lot. It is very similar. Chapters 10 and 11 in particular. Chapter 12 is pretty straightforward. There's not really much to dive in there, beyond the fact that, you know, the whole scene with Maxine going to Gabriel Ice's apartment is reminiscent of people walking into Paul Atreides' throne room in this Dune Messiah. But yeah, I mean, I think that it is. I think you've hit the nail on the head that it is very similar to Gravity's Rainbow and all of the references and the nestled information and all of the sort of tidbits that Pynchon leaves in there for the reader to research or to, you know, call attention to if it's history they already knew about. You know, we get some circle back on the Montauk stuff that I brought up a few episodes ago, certainly, to also kind of put the book into the little bit of a woo-woo territory as far as some of that information goes as well. But you know, throughout the entirety of Pynchon's ability to write that like hard-boiled crime stuff that we've been bringing up episode after episode is really present and on the page, particularly in the first meeting between Windust and Maxine. Yes. I would love to see that interaction on the street filmed in a movie. I think it'd be just so cool to see how that would play out in a sort of a noir styled film. And, you know, I don't think anyone's ever going to make this into a movie because the subject matter is pretty explosive, but
yeah,
you know, it'd be really cool if someone did.
Well, it's interesting too, because it kind of shifts in tone a little bit here, away from the strictly like hard-boiled detective noir into a sort of like The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, or even like an All the President's Men kind of thing, like where it's shifting into that more conspiracy related and you know, deep secrets and all that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit you know, again, playing with that genre, but still staying in that detective feel. So yeah, especially Maxine and Windust's interaction. I love that scene. It's awesome read.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about with that when it comes up. But I you know, this is these are info dump chapters, really, as far as continuing to provide more information about other characters that are going to be key to the storyline, especially later in the book. I forgot Windust was introduced, you know, 100 pages in. He's such a pivotal figure to the rest of the novel that for him to come in, you know, a fourth of the way through is interesting. But I've said it before, I love this book. These chapters are heavier to get through from a standpoint of, you know, research and if you want to understand everything Pynchon is talking about. But if you're just reading them for the content on the page, then they're equally as entertaining in that way, like you're talking about, Cody, of kind of an espionage or like newspaper sort of thriller kind of a storyline. And I just, especially in chapter 12, the whole interaction between Maxine and Gabriel Ice's wife, I love. I think it's really, really, really well done. So those are my thoughts.
I really like these chapters. They're definitely not as fun as the preceding three, but starting at, you know, chapter 6 or 7, you really have the inciting incident, you know, in a structural sense down, And from there on, for like the next, if I remember correctly, like 200 pages, it's all rising action.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about the way that these chapters do the rising action that I find very engaging. It's info dumpy for sure, but it's that kind of. It feels very much like we've all referred to, like a very hard-boiled, and it's the combination of the sheer intensity of the information dumping and the length of that trudging through what's usually a fairly short part of a detective novel is very fun. And, you know, you get characters like Windust and like Talus, who are such caricatures, but are such Finchonian caricatures that you definitely don't come away from any of the scenes with them thinking, well, they're just, you know, a stuck-up G-man or, you know, an airheaded trophy wife. Like, they are real characters with real motivations who you can kind of sense are much deeper than they are implied to be. Although Talus, you know, is pretty straightforwardly mentioned as such, but still.
Yeah, Talus is almost like a yuppie-fied Nancy Reagan.
Yeah,
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, O'Neill.
And I'm pretty sure Windust, to make a real-world comparison, is based on John O'Neill, an FBI agent who will become relevant later in the book that for reasons I won't talk about. But yeah, you're right. Even these two characters, for their you know, brief introductions, are really interesting and really multivariate and well rendered.
And then between them, you have Mark, who is just you know, a good old-fashioned author perspective insert, but of course, being Pynchon, it doesn't mean that that's actually his perspective. It's just an opportunity to soapbox with a perspective.
Yeah.
And that's always fun.
Pynchon walks around wearing military fatigues to talk to children. Luke, what about you?
Yeah, I found these chapters to be probably more interesting than entertaining. It does give you a lot to think about, you know, in terms of like what the parable means, what exactly is the nature of Marvin, and how does he continually, you know, show up, you know, if he's not working, if the company he works for is defunct, you know, what is he doing? How is he getting these packages? You know, the ice cream was discontinued years ago. I think it's interesting that, you know, we do get a literal info. Y'all were talking about info dumps in these chapters. We do get a literal info dump by Marvin onto Maxine, and then from Maxine onto the reader about Windus, which is interesting. But yeah, there's a lot of theorizing you could do about these chapters, you know, in terms of what the parable means, you know, what's going on with Marvin, why exactly Gabriel Ice's wife wants Maxine to investigate Hashslingers, and you know what the power dynamics are there. Yeah, I mean, these weren't the most entertaining chapters, like I said, but there's some cool stuff in here. I do like that we get introduced to Maxine's parents. I like those characters a fair amount. Um, it did strike me that you know, this is in some ways we get a lot of like kind of normal, almost everyday interactions with Maxine and her kids and her family. And I think this is the only Pynchon novel where we kind of get those kind of interactions, I want to say. You know, I mean, I guess we get a little bit of it in Mason and Dixon, in terms of family interactions and them
there's a
not
little
being.
bit in Vineland too. Not as much, but yeah, it's there.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. But yeah, this book definitely has the most kind of normal literary fiction type, you know, like just kind of normal everyday interactions between families, which I do really like. It does kind of serve to humanize the characters in a nice way. You know, Maxine's kids have bigger roles in this book than I actually remember them having. You know, they're not necessarily main characters, but they do get a lot of lines and a lot of attention. and stuff, which I like. I do kind of like that it's a nice mixture of conspiracy thriller and then kind of like family drama without the drama.
Yeah, definitely. So that being said, chapter 10 opens up on a performance of Guys and Dolls being put on by the Otto Kugelblitz School at the let me see here, the Scott and Nutella Vance Auditorium, which I'm glad you included in the notes, Cody, because the real life architecture that this building is based upon is
something else.
Really, it's something.
It looks like a cartoon. Like it literally looks like it came out of like a weird like fish-eyed version of The Simpsons.
Yeah,
it's
or
bizarre.
Like a Dr. Seuss book or something like that. Yeah, it's very odd.
There have been, from what I read of it, there have been a number of like structural engineers and whatnot that have gone and looked at it and been like, this thing should not, like this shouldn't be, it really should not be standing. There's this weird, so aside from just looking weird, it also, they are using like just every material available. And I don't know much about architect. I should. My dad's a contractor, so I've grown up around it. But there are certain materials that you're really not supposed to use in conjunction with each other when you're building, especially large buildings for safety purposes and whatnot. But they did it. This was basically a let's just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks kind of situation. And unchecked weird art design won through and made this just bizarre sight.
Just, one of those things that humans do every once in a while that's really fun.
Yeah.
But after the performance, Elaine, who is Maxine's mother, makes a fake overture to Horst to come back to their apartment to have some coffee. And this is where we learn that Horst is going to be taking the kids on a trip out to the Midwest where he's from. Also, this is where we get more information about Maxine clearly still having feelings for him. In several instances, she mentions wanting eye contact with him would be nice outside of the shower. She finds herself wondering why she's defending him. And it's very clear that she doesn't actually dislike him and maybe even wonders if she didn't act a little too rashly in wanting a divorce from him. Which is just, I really enjoy the fact that they have that kind of a relationship, because it's not something that's, I think, is really depicted very often with divorced couples. It's an interesting sort of track to take with it.
But yeah, to go back to what Luke mentioned about the portrayal of Maxine and her family life, that's, I think, actually one of my favorite parts of this book is the ability for a novel like this, a story like this, especially when you back it up and look at the fact that this is at its core a hard-boiled detective novel. Those stories are not always known for really well-grounded and well-developed characters, especially outside of the detective that it is focused on. Yeah. Usually ancillary characters in those are literally just there to help move the story forward. They're there to give information. They're there to be the person who did the thing. And that works fine for that genre, but I think for it to have these really grounded and relatable characters that are so deeply developed and well portrayed adds so much depth to the story, and you really get more. There's more investment, on the reader, what's happening to these characters. Like you genuinely, I cannot talk today. You genuinely care more about Maxine when she's in these kind of, situations that'll come up later in the book, or, where she's worried about her kids or worried about Horst. It adds just such a level of depth and really just investment in the book that I love.
Yeah, very, very true. I agree. And I think that it's interesting to see how he's developed as a writer from a standpoint of showing the different ways that he's portrayed like family dynamics, and they're, it's all we've mentioned it in Vineland, we've mentioned it in Mason and Dixon. It's all very warm, but it feels like Bleeding Edge is very much an outgrowth of him having a family dynamic for a longer amount of time and being able to appreciate some of that and render it more perhaps accurately to his own experience from a standpoint of how they interact with one another and everything. It's it's really awesome to see that, and it's a constant kind of through line here that reinforces the care that you have for Maxine, because if something happens to her, what's going to happen to her kids, but also just to see very common family dynamics on the page is really awesome. That kind of gentle ribbing or sarcasm is so common with people who have kids and people who have siblings, that it's really cool to see that so accurately put down on paper. So yeah, they go back to the apartment, and this is where we learn that Maxine does not appreciate the opera, despite the fact that her parents would love her to. We also find out that Horst has tried to bribe their children with a giant plate full of danishes and cheesecake, in a very comical sense, as they pile pastries on top of it's Elaine, in very grandmotherly fashion, plying the grandchildren with all sorts of pastries. I love that description of not enough. Each kid holding a plate piled unhealthily high with danishes, cheesecake, and strudel. I don't know how you stack anything on top of cheesecake slices.
Yeah, that's a good. Maybe on that. Maybe you use them as a barrier along the outside.
Yeah, there you go. It's a fence.
Yeah.
And then they go off to watch Space Ghost Coast to Coast, which as soon as I read that was in here, I was like, oh, Cody's going to have something to say about this.
I just love Space Ghost. Like, I haven't watched it in a long time, and it's a shame because it was a great show. I grew up watching that show. That whole early era of Adult Swim, or what would become Adult Swim, was really pivotal to my high school years, middle school and high school years. So I always appreciate a good reference to them. And again, this just kind of comes down to those little pop culture mentions in here that don't feel necessarily forced. They feel appropriate and for the time. And I can imagine Pinch on watching Space Ghost, because that's right up his alley with that kind of bizarre non sequitur humor, but at the same time being very aware of itself and very highbrow and lowbrow at the same time.
Yeah, I definitely would agree. He probably has it all on VHS somewhere in his house still.
Probably, yeah.
I would imagine. We also get our first piece of real-world research information I had to do, where it's revealed that Maxine also has a sister named Brooke, and Brooke is married to a man named Avi, who Ernie says here, "What?" Ernie with an impish glint. "You missed the press conference? Latest word is sometime before Labor Day, although he probably calls it Likud Day." Likud is a very real political party in Israel. They represent the right wing of Israel. It was founded by Menachem Begin, and in 1977, they were able to unseat the liberals in Israel for the very first time since the country was founded by the British Mandate. And the course of the country kind of changed for good as a result of that. Not only that, but they held power in the country until the mid-'80s, when they lost the Knesset election back to the Liberal Party. However, even when the Knesset was remaining in the hands of the Liberal Party, in 1992, a man by the name of Benjamin Netanyahu won the prime ministership, and has kind of basically just been there since today. There's been a couple of times where he's lost favor. There's been a couple of times where he's had to share power, but he's back firmly in the seat of power in the modern day, and has been for a very, very long time. So that is where that reference of Ernie's comes from. And they are known for being pretty politically zealous, which is why Ernie specifically mentions that, the line, "I said something. She wants to marry a zealot, her business. Life is full of these nice surprises." So there's very real context behind all of that. We also get the first reference of a software designed to annihilate Arabs, which we'll get to in a couple of pages. But that kind of ends sort of their conversation. We learn that Avi is a computer nerd just like everyone else in Silicon Alley, but for what purposes may be a bit different. In addition to what might be a bit different, we get the first mention of Nicholas Windust, who came on a surprise visit to interview Ernie and Elaine about their son-in-law. and are saying that he wants to talk to Maxine. Any thoughts that we have other than, I guess we can talk about the day the Earth stood still scene in here if you want.
I just thought it was interesting that he took a paragraph to explain that specific scene, just to talk about Ernie's face. Like it, I don't know if there's something there that I'm just missing as far as what he's trying to get at, or if he just really like that's just the long way, the really circuitous route of explaining the face that Ernie made when his picture was taken. It just feel like normally you would see that kind of thing and there would just be maybe like a single sentence about it referencing, you know, there's, the smile was like a scene from Day the Earth Stood Still, whatever. This just seems like there's a lot going on there that, I don't know, maybe I'm making more of it than there is. It just seems excessive even for him to go that long to get to that point.
The only reason that I could come up with as to why it was in there was, you know, Windust has spent most of his career with the government fighting communist rebels in South America, and his response in response to this whole thing that Ernie talks about is to bring up the fact that the movie was communist inspired. So I thought that the whole reason for this being there was him trying to paint the picture for Windust as a character that hates the communists so much he understands the deep lore behind.
He would go that far back into
random movies were inspired potentially by communist principles from an era he wasn't even alive for.
That makes sense. It did get me thinking about that movie. That's one of my favorite movies. So
the original one.
Oh yeah, I love that movie.
No love for Keanu, huh?
Have you seen that version of it?
I saw it in theaters.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I remember seeing the trailer for it and thinking like, okay, this is
it's weird.
Either going to be like at best okay, at worst it's going to be a complete shit show, and it was the latter. It's just one of those movies that never needed a remake. The original is perfectly fine. So,
what were you going to say, Will?
Well, so I can't really. I can't, I mean, literally can't. I don't know what the whole purpose of the description of that scene is. But the Sam Jaffe mention and the specific saying of Ernie, the specific mention of Ernie basically saying, I look like Sam Jaffe, and then going in to explain all of this so that you have a specific scene to look at. It's notable because honestly there aren't very many moments in Pynchon's books where he compares a character to like an actor or somebody relative to his general movie references. And the fact is that Ernie, every time he comes up in this book, it feels a lot like as I briefly mentioned regarding March Kelleher, like an opportunity for him to get on a soapbox. And there are a lot of people who, when they discuss this book online, talk about Ernie as a Pynchon self-insert. And I don't think that's crazy. And if anyone else has dug around and has found I forget what tabloid it was that got the picture of Pynchon back in
National
like
Enquirer.
2010.
Yeah.
With Jackson, he doesn't not look like Sam Jaffe in that role. Like, that's not an inaccurate comparison. So it seems like it might be a bit of like him saying, this is supposed to be my self-insert in this book.
Yeah, that could be too. Yeah.
But obviously there's more going on, because otherwise it would just be, I look like Sam Jaffe in The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and especially too, like getting back to the anti-communist stuff, like, you know, Ernie's response from a standpoint of talking to Maxine outside of that little bit of a frame of their interview, when he says, "This is 2001, Maxley." Ernie now shaking his head back and forth. "The Cold War is supposed to be over. How can these people not have changed or moved on? Where is this such a terrible inertia coming from?" And then Maxine says, "You always used to say their time hasn't passed, it's yet to come." So seeming once again that Ernie is confused about why someone would still care that much about the blacklist. But I think Maxine's response to Ernie is particularly relevant, because from that standpoint of their time hasn't passed, it's yet to come. If you think about the blacklist and the obsession of the intelligence agencies and capturing communists, it was really about like information control, public spying, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And out of 9/11, you get the Patriot Act, which gives you mass surveillance, which leads to what I think, Pynchon could be saying is their time. The idea that these things that occurred and what happened in the aftermath allowed the intelligence agencies to really step into a controlling interest in the country from a broader public acceptance than they would have had in the past.
This is definitely a stretch, we're about to say, but this book is a lot about 9/11, which we've kind of dipped in and out of, and I'm sure we'll talk about a lot more as it goes on. But just the title, "The Day the Earth Stood Still," does kind of remind me of the day of 9/11. Like a lot of schools were closed that day after what happened. Flights were grounded. I from my own memories of that day, I feel like there were just kind of like there's a lot of people sitting at home watching TV.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, that's definitely a stretch, but I could definitely, like you could call the 9/11, the day the Earth stood still, and I wouldn't really
People were
argue
calling
with you.
it that for a while.
Yeah,
The day the
Yeah.
world stood. They were calling it something close to that. Yeah, or the day the world stopped turning, or something like that.
Yeah, and there's definitely some pretty salient symbolism with I can't remember the alien, the robot's name.
Klaatu.
Is that the robot he used?
The robot, so the traveler himself, I believe, was Klaatu, and I don't remember the robot having a name. I think it was just the robot.
Yeah, I don't know. I just mean the imagery of him standing over cities, raising them.
Mm-hmm.
There's some resonance there.
Gort was the robot's name. Sorry.
Thank you. Gorm was coming to me, and that's not anything relevant.
That is a thing, though.
Yeah.
So Maxine is walking around downtown Manhattan. It's raining. She has an umbrella with her, and who should make contact with her umbrella with their own umbrella than Nicholas Windust himself. I really love this scene. Like I said in kind of my recap of the chapters, I would love to see this interaction between the two of them sort of played out on film. Like the rain is appropriately moody for what's going to happen and appropriately noirish, but also just the way that Maxine really kind of like sizes him up in this moment. And I think that Maxine is almost a more, in this respect to her character, is almost a more well-refined version of Frenesi, in that she has the same kind of twinge of interest in the uniform, in the power that the uniform represents. She finds herself second guessing, why she's doing something, why she's giving him the time of day, and it feels a bit more maturely handled than a detractor of Vineland could say there, from a standpoint of her internal monologue with it. And obviously this comes to head later in the book in a way that we'll get to eventually, and goes back to the stuff I talked about in Vineland about, these women kind of consistently giving themselves over to allegories for power as kind of a idea of the corruption of movements to power, things like that. But I love their interaction with each other, and I love the description of him where it says, "Evening, Miss Tarnow." He's holding out a business card, which she recognizes as a copy of the same one Ernie passed on to her last night, the one she doesn't take. This one she doesn't take. It's okay, no GPS chip or anything. Oh boy, the fucking voice. Sonorous, overcoached, phony as a cold call on an answering machine. She flicks a sidelong glance, 50-ish, midnight brown shoes, Elaine's idea of a nice trench coat with a high polyester content. Ever since grade school, exactly the kind of person everybody, including herself, was warned her to stay away from. So of course, she starts in with the blurting. "I already have one of these. This is you in person, Nicholas Windust. I don't suppose you carry a federal ID, a warrant or something? Just being a careful citizen, understand, trying to do my part. When will she learn to dummy up? No wonder the borderline personality folks keep after her. Their seasonal nooges are in fact paranoia calibration updates, and she ignores them at her peril. So what's wrong with me, she wonders. Am I some kind of make-nice compulsive? Am I as desperate as Heidi always tells me I am? I love that for all the reasons that I already stated. I think it's just much better and more interestingly handled than it is with Frenessy and Brock and Vineland.
Yeah, I would definitely agree.
I think it's really interesting that he says there's no GPS chip in the one that he hands to her. Because, like, how did he find her that day? I mean, it is shown that she's possibly being followed, but he does kind of tip his hat that the card that she was given by her parents probably did have a GPS chip in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It definitely does seem like he's saying that, yeah.
Yeah.
I also think Nicholas Windus is just a very interesting character, and I can't talk about everything, obviously, because that gets into stuff later in the book, but like the fact that he is this sort of, in a way, icon of evil who did all this awful shit in South America, but still has an intense desire to protect his own home country, and despite that seems to have like a genuine, like, I guess you could call it perverse love for the countries that he ruined, because like he wants to go to a Dominican restaurant. He speaks some aspect of the language. He married a woman from one of the countries that he was stationed in. Like there, and the talk of like his karmic debt, as we'll get to in the next pages here, seems almost like he is a character who is aware of that karmic debt and perhaps carries guilt over it, to the degree that he feels the need to still kind of represent some of these cultures that he plundered and destroyed, partially as a result of him doing his job. I again, like in the same way that I think that this aspect of Maxine's handled better than Frenessy, I think also that Windust is sort of a more interesting figure than Brock, and that there is some very real, I guess I'll say, like, moral tug of war going on within him, or some sort of character tug of war going on with him that Brock does not have.
He's definitely trying to balance the scales from what he's done, and obviously the weight of what he has had his hands in is, I don't think, anything you can really ever balance out. But he certainly seems to be making an effort. I think Brock was more maybe sociopathic and unaware of the damage that he was causing. Maybe not even unaware.
I just don't think he
uncaring.
cared. He was a narcissist.
Yeah, and so I think there's a little more of a human edge to Windust that makes for a. I don't want to say he's a more compelling character than Brock because of that, but I definitely think it lends a different way of looking at him as an antagonist.
Yeah, well, and I think that too, if you want to take it, in the kind of classic Pinchonian way of characters as allegories for periods of time or like aspects of history or something like that, you can easily look at Brock as a icon of the insanity of the Reagan years, from a standpoint of all of the stuff that Reagan did while he was in office, all of the stuff that the CIA and these intelligence agencies did to suppress socialist and communist leanings in South America, importing crack into majority black neighborhoods, and then versus Clinton, Bush, Bush too. Like all of that was more of that like compassionate government era where suddenly things had to be a bit more even keeled. Suddenly we couldn't have a lieutenant colonel in Congress testifying about deliberate criminal actions. Suddenly we had to present a little bit more of a public face to the people than what maybe was going on during the Reagan years. And I think kind of Nicholas Windust and Brock Vond are two good avatars of those political periods from a standpoint of the intelligence agencies.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I would go even further, and I would, as I mentioned during Rhineland episodes, I would argue that the best way to interpret Brock is as like essentially a hologram of the power structures at that point in time. And the moment, and the say that is the moment, he receives, he loses funding, he just disappears from existence. He just stops being.
Yeah.
Literally, the world around lapses, and he is in the afterlife. And on the other hand, here, Wind is not an FBI agent. Is just kind of the scumbag who represented. And so instead of being like someone whose entire psychology is built around degrading those around him, Windust, like, he believes he loves Chile. He believes he was doing them a favor.
Yep.
And so, like, his love of what's the drink? Morir Soñando is him believing, hey, I have a great cultural appropriation for Central American cuisine. And no, he doesn't. He likes things that taste good the same way that everyone likes things that taste good. He thinks this is authentic because it tastes good, and it's something that was thrown in a blender in the back of the shop.
A creamsicle.
Yeah, this is how he approaches life. He has this cognitive dissonance that he doesn't overturn because it's much easier and much more comfortable and very profitable.
Right. Yeah, he's bought into the idea that America is a benevolent force. And so therefore the things that he's done, even though maybe they nag him somewhere deep down that, to quote Jack Nicholson, he doesn't talk about at parties, he still is bought into the experiment, so to speak. Yeah. Or the at least depiction of America, where Brock is not. Brock is a sociopathic scumbag. You're right, Will. Brock is the hologram, or the kind of, manifestation, ghostly or otherwise, of what the actual capabilities and destructive power of the evil empire is.
Well, and to piggyback on that, really, I think that dichotomy between those two, I think, really lends itself to why Windust may, when you really look at it, may be the more dangerous of those two. Brock is unhinged and relentless in what he does. He's also there is an impulsiveness that exists within him that I think works to his detriment at times. Windust is calculating and like understands very clearly what it is he needs to do, how to do it, and how to come away from it without with minimal damage to himself, his handlers, whoever it is he's working for at the time. And I think that is, as you were both saying, is reflective of the eras in which they work and what makes a government that is essentially doing still the same things it was doing 40, 50 years ago. Just it knows how to do it better and how to cover its tracks better, which makes it essentially more worrisome.
Very true.
Yeah.
So
and just to flip the other side of the mirror, I guess. Maxine, I mean, my impression isn't even necessarily that she is less swayed by authority figures than he was, but like honestly, when Fernie was seduced by Brock, she was what, like 24 at least?
Something like that. Yeah.
Maxine is entering middle age. She's a grown-ass woman who is aware of her urges. She can resist if she feels like it. I'm not sure. I mean, I obviously are quite a few differences between the characters, but I'm not sure that that's even a strong difference in the character.
No, I don't. What I mean is just that, basically what you said is that Frenesi is incapable of controlling that, whereas Maxine is capable of questioning why she's doing this, questioning why she's, allowing herself to kind of get wooed into his trap, so to speak. Whereas, you don't see that out of that character, which is why I'm just saying I think that she is a more developed character on the page from a standpoint of how she's handling it.
Yeah. I see.
But no, they do both have the same seduced by power aspect of their character, for sure. So the two of them sit down at said Dominican restaurant, and as the creamsicles are being dropped into the blender, Windust brings up the thing that I spent 2 days researching, where it says, Windust exhales audibly through his nose, more in regret than annoyance. You want to know what's been getting the security community all nervous lately, Miss Tarnow? It's a piece of software called Promise, originally designed for federal prosecutors to share data among the district courts. It works regardless of what language your files are written in, even what operating system you're using. The Russian mob have been selling it to the rug riders, and more to the point, Mossad have been generously traveling all over the world helping local agencies install it, sometimes throwing in a Krav Maga course as a sales incentive. So, Promise software is a real thing.
Oh, yes.
And I apologize for the length of this in advance to the listeners, but this is a thing that dates back to the 60s and has continued in courts and legal proceedings and conspiracy theories and sort of public disinformation and cover-ups up until 2003. So I spent a lot of time researching it and writing stuff down about it. So I just kind of have like a thing I'll go through here for you. The earliest pilot versions of Promise, before it was called Promise, before it was, really nailed down what the software was going to be, were actually used by the CIA in Vietnam as part of the Phoenix program. Now, that's a whole other history that you can read multiple books about, but in essence, the Phoenix program was what the CIA was doing in Vietnam to track suspected members of the Viet Cong. This program ultimately killed a documented 26,369 people by assassination or torture, and it neutralized, whatever that term may mean in this context, a total of 81,740 people. What would eventually become Promise was developed by a man named Bill Hamilton. Now, also just a weird thing, Bill Hamilton's wife worked for Jack Ruby at his club in the U.S.
Oh,
wow. So that's kind of a weird thing that I also found. But Bill Hamilton and his wife Nancy founded a legal firm called Inslaw that was going to create software for prosecutors and for database collection materials. So fast forwarding a little bit, the U.S. government realizes that its case management software is in dire need of an update. Promise is able to combine databases, but it also has the ability, after a few enhancements later on down the line, to track people. And according to a lot of the legal documentation that you can read through, in February of 1983, a man came to the Inslaw offices for a presentation on the Promise software, calling himself Dr. Ben Orr, claiming to be a public prosecutor from Israel, who wanted to purchase the software for their governmental records keeping over there. The man left and no purchase was made, but as it turns out, the guy claiming to be Dr. Ben Orr was actually a man named Raphael Eitan, who was chief of the IDF's anti-terror intelligence unit in Israel at the time. It also turned out later in court filings that the DOJ sent him over to Inslaw to steal the software, which he did successfully upon leaving their offices in 1983. Not only that, but the Promise software was then sold to as many as 80 other countries at a profit to Israel by a man named Dr. Earl W. Bryan, who's a pretty big deal in this case as we go on. Earl Bryan was actually a business associate of Reagan's Attorney General Ed Meese. Another wrinkle to this is that a journalist named Danny Casolaro, who was investigating the whole affair for years, was killed or committed suicide, depending upon what you believe. And all of his research, which consisted of boxes and boxes of documents, was stolen. He was in Martinsburg, West Virginia, to meet a source claiming to have information relevant to what he was researching, which, according to what information did eventually get brought out later, he claimed was an international cabal called the Octopus, which is suspected, or he suspected it to be a group of figures from multiple governments, the mob, and intelligence agencies that tried to shape world events from behind the scenes. So that's kind of the overview of a lot of this information that I'll go into. But going back a bit to 1970, Promise was initially funded by a Law Enforcement Assistance Administration grant. And in 1982, it won a $9.6 million contract from the U.S. government to install the public domain version funded by this grant in 20 of the U.S. attorneys' offices as a pilot program. If that program was a success, it was then going to go into another 74 federal prosecutors' offices across the nation. The real power of Promise, according to the stuff I read, was that it had the ability to integrate multiple computer databases without writing additional code. So it basically had the ability to convert data into information. This is apparently how earlier versions were used to track people for the Phoenix program. This is also how the CIA and Mossad would later use it to track operations, agents, and their targets once the software was out there and in their hands. Interestingly, though, Promise was not the only software being developed to do this at the time. There was another LEAA grant that was given to a program called Daylight, and that was being created by a important figure named who went by the name of Jensen, who worked in Reagan's DOJ underneath Ed Meese once Reagan was president. However, they closed up shop when Promise won a contract for the Alameda District Attorney's Office before the federal contract. After this process starts to get the federal contracts put through to place, Hamilton decides that he's going to take Inslaw private, and he develops a new version of Promise that's not public domain because it didn't use the funds that he won from the grant by the LEAA. Hamilton writes to the DOJ asking them to waive rights to the new version. The DOJ agrees. A man by the name of Lawrence McWhorter, who was the director of the Executive Office of U.S. Attorneys and was overseeing the pilot program in 81, gives a portion of his oversight job to a guy named C. Madison Brewer, who actually used to work for Inslaw but was fired. The DOJ then hired him to oversee the contract between them and Inslaw from the government side rather than the Inslaw side. In later court proceedings, Madison would say that all of his actions were approved by Deputy Attorney General Lowell Jensen. Lowell Jensen is the guy who developed Daylight that was competing with Promise before these contracts were signed. Brewer was paired up with a man named Peter Viendix, who'd been overseeing contracts with a company called Hadron. Hadron had connections to Ed Meese, once again Reagan's Attorney General. And then after the Inslaw installation of Promise began, the DOJ suddenly decided that they were going to claim Inslaw was bankrupt. They did this with no reasoning or motivation or knowledge of Inslaw's finances. They just publicly announced that Inslaw was bankrupt. And they demanded that Inslaw hand over Promise in case the company could not complete its installation in the 20 district attorneys' offices. Inslaw agrees to this, but on the conditions that it had no proprietary right to the new version of Promise, and that it could not be distributed outside the boundaries of their government contract. The DOJ agreed to that, but they did so on the grounds that Inslaw could prove that the new Promise software was made without using public money. Inslaw agreed to that, and then gave them over the source code, which is just it's a huge mistake on their part. Once this happened, the DOJ refused to verify that the newly enhanced version of the software was made without public money. Inslaw protests this. The DOJ decides to withhold its money that it was going to be paying to Inslaw on its end of the contract. And then 2 years later, Inslaw is forced into bankruptcy by the dissolution of their contract. As all of this was going on, Bill Hamilton got a call from the CEO of Hadron, once again the company controlled by Ed Meese, and a man by the name of Dominic Leahy, who claimed to be the CEO, was offering to buy Inslaw. Hamilton refuses him. Dominic Leahy says that he has government friends who will force him to sell. Then, a second company called SCT attempts to buy Inslaw. SCT, after the refusal, tells Inslaw's customers that they're going to go into bankruptcy soon and that they won't survive reorganization. And then shortly after that is when the DOJ claimed they were bankrupt. Now, on June 9th, 1986, Inslaw sues the DOJ in bankruptcy court. Their lawyer, who was fired after the case closed and was a 10-year partner at his law firm, argues that a creditor cannot exercise control over the debtor property. In 1987, the judge rules that the DOJ stole Promise through, quote, trickery, fraud, and deceit, and decided to award Inslaw $6.8 million in damages. It was also revealed through these court proceedings that the DOJ planned to put Promise up for public auction. The Court of Appeals upheld the ruling from the lower court, and then the Supreme Court denied to hear the case. Now, interestingly, while this court case was going on, the IRS audited Inslaw, and the IRS lawyer requested that the judge overseeing the legal case liquidate the company. The judge refused this request, and then when his term was up, he was not reappointed to the bench, and the person who took his seat on the bench was the IRS lawyer who demanded the company be liquidated. Inslaw appealed this decision to the Attorney General. Appealed to the Attorney General at the time, Dick Thornborough, to investigate the DOJ, and the appeal was never followed up on. After this, Hamilton says that he began receiving multiple phone calls alleging that a man named Earl Bryan helped orchestrate the Reagan October surprise, and that his payout for doing so was going to be a cut of the Promise action. For those who do not know, the Reagan October surprise is when Reagan revealed that on the day of his inauguration, the Iranian hostages were going to be coming home. Part of this included a giant payout to the Iranians. That was the Iran-Contra affair and that whole scandal, or at least half of it. So this was going to be this guy's payment for helping Reagan orchestrate that. Earl Bryan and the DOJ would then proceed to sell Promise to as many as 80 foreign and domestic agencies after all of this took place. The people calling Hamilton included an ex-Mossad agent named Ari Ben-Menash, and he said that Promise had been modified to include a backdoor that would allow the DOJ to eavesdrop and spy on anybody using it. So they'd essentially created a Trojan horse. This program, the upgraded version of Promise with this DOJ backdoor, ended up becoming the precursor program to PRISM and the other NSA programs that tracked mass surveillance data from U.S. citizens on their phone calls, text messages, and emails that Edward Snowden revealed the existence of to the general public in 2013. While all of the statements and memos that were sent to Hamilton from another 30 sources were never brought to court, they were consistent enough to begin a wider investigation. The then chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, a man by the name of Jack Brooks, launched an inquiry that began in 1989, and it lasted another 3 years. Their findings showed that Ed Meese and Lowell Jensen conspired to steal Promise, and the report suggested that it should have been the basis for a wider grand jury investigation. In 1992, the committee asked William Barr of Trump fame as his last attorney general, who sort of, on that occasion didn't really do much of an investigation into what was going on with him, was appointed to settle the claims that Inslaw was making against the DOJ. William Barr would decide to appoint a judge to this case, not an independent counsel, meaning that the DOJ was responsible for investigating themselves. In 1990, the Judiciary Committee asks the CIA if it has Promise. CIA says that it's unlikely. However, later on, the internal investigator tasked by the CIA to answer this question says that the DOJ gave CIA Promise. Not only that, but that the CIA had been involved in taking it. Essentially, they were the ones who contracted Raphael Eitan to go into Inslaw and take it during the meeting that he took there. Even later, Canadian documents show that versions of Promise were in use in Canadian intelligence agencies. Later on, intelligence officials and legal officials in Canada claim the documents are in error. Raphael Eitan's anti-terror unit was also found to have access to Promise, and Ben-Menash alleges that a lot of other departments within Israel do as well. Ben-Menash also reveals in 1991 that he had attended a presentation of Promise in Tel Aviv that was conducted by Earl W. Bryan. In that presentation, Earl Bryan would say that every single U.S. intelligence agency was already using it. During the time of the meeting, Ben-Menash's superior was Raphael Eitan. Here's an even weirder part. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North used Promise at his 6,100-foot command center on the 6th floor of the DOJ as part of his dealings with FEMA, and revealed in the Iran-Contra hearings that he used the software to track dissidents and potential troublemakers within the U.S. The software, as he was using it, gave him the ability to pull up anyone's file who'd been arrested at a political protest or anyone who had refused to pay taxes. When Jack Brooks asked about this in the Iran-Contra hearings. The hearing was immediately suspended, and then when it was reconvened after a confidential private hearing, Oliver North's involvement with FEMA was dropped completely from the investigation. Earl W. Bryan, just to give you some backstory on him, worked as a combat physician supporting Operation Phoenix in Vietnam. After he came home from Vietnam, he was given a position in Governor Reagan's administration as Secretary of Health. He then resigned in 1974 to run for Senate, but he lost his election. So he went into the private sector working for a company called Zionics, a company which was later cited by the SEC for market manipulation and illegally paying commissions to brokers for selling their stock. Later, when the Governor Reagan's governorship ended, he was involved in a public scandal in which he was said to have stole 70,000 state welfare files. Bryan later returned them, claiming that he had taken them as part of a legal contract to develop a better welfare system for the state of California. In 1980, he founded a venture capital firm to invest in biotech companies that folded. He also tried to start 2 other companies. Now, Ed Meese's wife, Ursula Meese, sent $15,000 to his biotech venture capital firm as an investment on behalf of her husband. Some believe that he was also the recipient of promise as a payback for his October Surprise involvement. Bryan claims, and this is the October Surprise stuff, that he wasn't in Paris in 1980, but was in Canada. But as the Inslaw affair began, he was appointed to the White House as a chief healthcare advisor to Ronald Reagan. So he's working for the same guy again. Strange enough, though, he would report directly to Ed Meese, not to Reagan. He was also responsible for taking investors in Meese's company Hadron on tours of the White House to curry investment opportunities in favor for Meese's company. Ben Menash claims that the $40 million payout to the Iranians to release the hostages was done by Earl Bryan in Paris. Bryan testified under oath that he wasn't there and that he didn't have a valid passport at the time. However, according to multiple sources, Earl told his Canadian investors in his venture capital firm that he would be in Paris during October to deal with a medical research firm, the Pasteur Institute. Yet, when investigators reached out to the Pasteur Institute, their investigation revealed that the research firm had no business with him or had even heard of him before. Earl Bryan later said that he was in Paris, but in April of 1981, not in October of 1980, but his passport has no entry visas for Paris at that time or any time. Another aspect of Earl Bryan's backstory comes from a man named Michael Reconskiuto, who prior to his arrest in 1991 provided the Hamiltons with an affidavit stating that Earl Bryan, through a company called Whack and Hunt, provided him with a copy of promise to modify to input the backdoor access into the program before the DOJ sold it to other countries. He was doing this work for the DOJ at the DOJ in 1983 and 1984. Bryan denies knowing who this man is. Bryan also denies having anything to do with Inslaw or any of this affair when it was happening. Despite this, however, the House Judiciary Committee received a report from the Riverside County Sheriff's Office stating that on September 10th, 1980, a group of arms dealers, buyers, and intelligence agents gathered on the Cabazon Reservation for a weapons demonstration, a demonstration that was overseen by Whack and Hunt. And Michael Reconskiuto says that this is the same company that gave him the software. This whole deal on the reservation was part of Oliver North's Iran-Contra dealings. Earl Bryan happened to be in the area when this was going on, and when stopped by local police, he told them that he was with the CIA, and so they needed to leave him alone. Ben Menash once again says that Mossad wanted promise to follow Palestinian dissidents and track the broader Arab population. He also explains that it was the Israelis who paid Hadron the money to pay off the law firm to fire Inslaw's counsel and to give the lawyer his settlement, which is verified by some documents that the IDF has internally from the Mossad that say that they paid for a lawyer in the U.S. So when they fired this guy who was a 10-year partner at his firm, he got a giant cash payout for it. At the same time all of this was going on from the House Judiciary Committee, they also asked for an investigation into the death of Danny Casolaro, the journalist who was spending years of his life looking into all of this. On August 10th, he was found dead in a hotel in West Virginia, and each of his wrists had been slashed 10 times. He'd gone to Martinsburg to meet a supposed informant whose name he had not revealed or written down. He had to call his family the day before to tell them that he would be home late for a gathering they were having. Martinsburg police strangely allowed the body to be embalmed before the family was called. They also told hotel employees not to speak to reporters, and the hotel room was immediately scrubbed down by a cleaning service. All of his notes that he was seen carrying into the hotel room the day before were missing, and at one time he apparently told his brother not to believe stories if anything happened to him. Through all the congressional investigations that took place, the DOJ refused to cooperate with them. They delayed any info turnovers, they denied any requests for additional information, and they reneged on an agreement of full and open access to the House Judiciary Committee's investigators. Every single document that was subpoenaed was reported by the DOJ as lost or accidentally destroyed. Upon Clinton's inauguration, the cases were found by the DOJ to have no basis, and all of them were dropped. So that's the historical stuff. Now, in 2003, Bill Hamilton called for authorities to review the intelligence failures on 9/11, claiming that the PROMIS software had been diverted to Osama bin Laden. According to Hamilton, former FBI agent Robert P. Hansen stole PROMIS from the U.S. government and sold it to the Russians as part of his ongoing operation as a double agent for the KGB. Bin Laden then bought the software on the Russian black market to track intelligence agencies and whether or not people were onto him. Law enforcement would later confirm that Hansen did give PROMIS to the Russians, and that the software did indeed make its way to bin Laden. Hansen made the sale for about $200 million, and with it, bin Laden was able to monitor the U.S. efforts to track him down, but it also gave him access to databases on specific targets and the ability to monitor electric banking transactions so he could better hide his money. The government has continued to deny using PROMIS or that Hansen turned it over. However, in the criminal complaint against Hansen, they mention that he had extensive use of two other programs called FOMIS and Coins as part of his job, and these are believed to be upgraded versions of PROMIS, just like PRISM and all the NSA stuff. Hamilton mentions that Robert Mueller acknowledged to an attorney for Inslaw that the FBI system is based on the Inslaw software, quote unquote, a fact which was disputed for decades. Mueller also referred any further inquiry to the DOJ, but never scheduled the meeting for that investigation to begin. And obviously, Robert Mueller was the one who eventually did the Russia investigations with Donald Trump. Despite decades of denials, the intel agencies for the U.S. admitted about a month after 9/11 that bin Laden may have used the PROMIS software, additionally confirming on October 16, 2001, that the government used PROMIS to track classified information in federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And that is where things left off. They finally admitted that they had it, and no follow-up was ever done from a legal perspective.
Absolutely wild.
Yeah. That was an insane thing for me to just slowly uncover through dozens of news articles.
Yeah. I had knowledge of Robert Hansen before, that like if you're interested in like incidences in which American citizens or people working for the government have been implicated in spy programs, that dude has arguably the biggest impact of pretty much anybody else.
Yeah.
There's a lot that he was responsible for, and it's an absolutely wild story. But to find out that he was tied up in the PROMIS thing was just really, and again, I did not have the time to dive into it like you did. So I appreciate that you did the heavy lifting there.
Yeah, you're welcome. So that is the real history behind that single line of dialogue. To give you guys just a taste of, I'm sure, the research that Thomas Pynchon was doing. There's actually an excellent article by Wired, of all people, published in '93 that has like a really good overview of this whole case, and it's where I wrote most of my notes from. I found it after I did a bunch of really annoying reading of court documents and stuff, and I was like, well, I wish I had found this earlier. So if a reader kind of wants to, if you couldn't follow what I was saying, which is completely possible, and you want to just sort of do some research for yourself, the article is called "The Inslaw Octopus," and it's very well written and very well researched by the author of the article, whose name is escaping me at this time.
Sorry to cut you off,
Yeah.
but I'm glad you mentioned that because the Pynchon wiki links to an article that isn't there anymore, and
yeah. Not only that, I was shocked at the overall lack of information that the Pynchon wiki had about that.
I was gonna say the same exact thing. Like that's one of those. Like I was interested in it, so I went. That link didn't work. I jumped over to Wikipedia. That's where I was like, Jesus, I could see this becoming a whole thing. So, yeah, and we'll find that article and put the link in the show notes as well.
Yeah, very, very good. I didn't know Wired did political reporting, but apparently they do.
They used to, at least. And for anyone who is inspired by that to go researching these things by themselves, just a heads up that any mention in any of these books we've covered, and any of the mentions in the books we haven't covered from Pynchon about acronyms being tools of obfuscation, this is the time where that became very tangible. So if you look up promise, you're going to get other things. If you look up any of the acronyms that Kate just mentioned, you're going to get other things. And a lot of them conspicuously, as programs started around 2001 to 2003, as clear intentional obfuscation methods.
Yeah, 100%. So basically, Windust believes that potentially Avi is mixed up in all of this stuff with what the Mossad is doing with Promise. And obviously the Russian mob aspect is where that kind of Bin Laden connection and Robert Hansen comes in, that he mentions in that quote. And there's some fun back and forth here of Maxine poking at the anti-Semitism angle, which I enjoyed in the dialogue. Oh, devious these Jews! Like that line in particular is really funny. He then also mentions the Pollard case back in 1985. I did not have the energy to read the whole thing about this, but apparently this is, an individual who was passing classified information into Israel in the 1980s, and was prosecuted for it. And he is correct in that the New York Times talked about that case. So it was very, very out in the open. I also love the quote here from Maxine, where it says, how right-wing, Maxine wonders, does a person have to think that the New York Times is a left-wing newspaper?
Yeah.
That's still kind of the perception of that newspaper, which I think is so funny.
Yeah.
When it's like a center-right newspaper. Like, they're not alt-right by any means, but they are not a leftist they're not the Daily Worker. Like they're very much an establishment sort of WASP apparatus thing. He also mentions in this conversation something called a cyanim, which is a actual term. It's an idea for people who are sympathetic to the security concerns in Israel, but who live in the Western Hemisphere. And they are, sleeper agents is maybe a bit grandiose of a term for them, but they are people who, the IDF or Mossad can sort of call upon to pass information to them, despite not necessarily being, sort of members of Mossad directly. So that is also rooted in very real concerns from an intelligence agency perspective. And that is pretty much all of the information from these 2 pages as it relates to sort of real life controversy and potential conspiracies. And at this point, this is about when Maxine decides that she needs to leave, but not before Windust asks him about hash slingers, and he's curious why Maxine is looking into them. And Maxine just kind of says, like, "Look, I'm above board. I'm not an intelligence agent. It's not a big deal." So she gets herself out of the room. However, Nicholas Windust says the very ominous line, "I hope I see you again sometime." And then she has a dream later that night. A dream where she is doing how does it word here? In which they're not exactly fucking, but fucking around, definitely. Which I enjoyed. I think the dream is relevant because it does say, outside of like the stuff to Maxine's sort of psyche and her interest in being seduced by power, there's a line in here that says, She has sought to escape, but not sincerely enough for the penis, which is wearing some strange headgear, possibly a Harvard football helmet. That reads to me as Pinchot once again making, the connection of the interlinked nature of sort of the waspy elements of the country and the government, and how those two things kind of work hand in hand with one another. And then, Cody, you messaged me about Marvin. Did you want to talk about Marvin?
I think he might low-key be my favorite character in the book.
He's great. He's really good.
He's awesome. And I couldn't... There is a character I guess I'm thinking of, or maybe it's an amalgam of other characters in these kind of like espionage conspiracy books where they have access to information, not necessarily that they are the originator of that information, but they are able to get information to the main character in a very serendipitous manner. Kind of one of those things like right here, it's, this is the first time we're meeting him and he's, bringing her, I can't remember even what he brought her initially, but he shows up later, with ice cream that no one asked for, that her and Horst were just having a conversation about. He's just kind of like always there conspicuously when something is needed, and he just happens to have it and then just disappears. I love that. It's something that really on paper shouldn't work because it feels a little too like Deus Ex Machina. Yeah. But it does. Like it works I think in this genre specifically, like you kind of allow that suspension of disbelief to let a character like him randomly show up with a USB drive that just happens to have, all this complete dossier on Windust. And then later just happens to show up with ice cream that doesn't exist anymore, that no one ordered, but he had, it's really interesting. And I think he's a really, and this is the bike delivery man is also a very like early 2000s sort of character. Not that the job itself didn't exist before and after then. It's just like that. It was the time weirdly when they were very focused on his characters. Mm-hmm. I think the other one that really comes to mind initially is Tires from the show Spaced.
Oh, sure. That's a callback.
Yeah, I love Spaced. But it, that was like I don't know the reason specifically that job became so prominent in a lot of media at that time, but it did for a little while. And Marvin is just a great version of that.
He is. And Cosmo.com was a real company.
Yep.
They were a venture capital, according to Wikipedia, they were a venture capital funded online company that promised free 1-hour delivery of videos, games, DVDs, music, mags, books, food, basics, and more. They also delivered Starbucks coffee in several major cities in the United States.
They were Uber Eats and Grubhub before all that existed.
Yeah, basically. They were out of business by April of 2001, so they lasted a good 3 years.
They had a run.
After they were founded in 1998. They're often referred to as like a prime example of the .com bubble companies because they were one of those and they went out just as quickly. The brand was bought in January 2013 of all times by Yummy.com, which I hate that URL. That's gross. Yummy.com announced that they would restart Cosmo, but it didn't. In March 2018, they started as a warehouse club, very similar to like Dizzy and all of the stuff we talked about in episode 1 of this season. We just missed the website, guys. They went offline in July of 2023. We could have taken the listeners through a tour of Cosmo.com. So yeah, it works for a real service. And this time he's dropped off a flash drive, which I also love the little aside where they're like, where Maxine doesn't know what it is. Yeah. And her kids have to be like, oh yeah, that's one of those 8 megabyte flash drives that are really popular now.
That's what you do as an old middle-aged adult when you don't know how technology works. You ask your kids because they know.
Yeah. Yep. Not only that, but Ziggy is smart enough to say, no, you don't just plug that directly into your computer. Yeah. Let me have someone look at it first.
Which should go without saying. It genuinely should go without saying. But there was a time a little bit after this book takes place, and I don't know if Kate, if you were a fan at the time, but Nine Inch Nails had this whole alternate reality game that took place around the release for Year Zero.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it included Reznor and his people leaving USB flash drives in random places, and people would just take them without thinking twice. And I remember like I was experiencing this whole thing as it was happening. It was an amazing thing to do, and really did a lot for the album. But I would hear about these people finding, and like people online were like, "Oh, I hope I find one. I hope I find one." I'm like, I don't, because I'm not just going to find a fob in a bathroom at a wherever, and then just be like, cool, take it home, plug it in, let's see what fires up here. So there's a level of trust that those people were having that I just can't wrap my head around. So
for any listeners, if you find a flash drive in public, don't just plug it into your computer. Yeah. Although flash drives I feel like aren't really that much of a thing anymore. Even that has kind of been.
Do you want to know how many I have at my desk right now?
Oh, I have a bunch too, but that doesn't mean that the youth are still using them.
That's
Cody.
true. That's true.
Well, the youth don't know what a computer
I can count
file
at least
is.
6. That's true.
Like, there's a whole different side of this cultural evolution that has happened since this book came out that kind of invalidates any of that,
that's true.
common sense.
Yeah, definitely. We learned that all that's on the flash drive is a giant text file, and the text file happens to be a deep web directory for spooks called Face Mask. This seems to be a Facebook, but for spies.
Yes.
Which I love that it's called Face Mask. That really brings to mind like the Mission Impossible rubber masks that
my god,
that those movies play with all of the time. But what is on it is the directory for Nicholas Windust, and it does not appear, as Will said, that he works for the FBI. He works for something worse, if possible. If there is a brother or god forbid sisterhood of neoliberal terrorists, Windust has been there from the very jump. A field operative whose first recorded job as an entry-level gopher was in Santiago, Chile, on the 11th of September, 1973, spotting for planes that bombed the presidential palace and killed Salvador Allende. Interesting that that's also a 9/11 incident. Yep. I believe that that's a purposeful choice by Pynchon.
Oh, yeah.
But if you don't know what that's referring to, that is a Nixon-Kissinger-backed coup to replace Allende with a military junta in order to suppress a popular left-wing uprising in the country by a socialist party, is what that was. One of many coups and direct interventions that were done in South America by Nixon and then later Reagan. So that was where he got his start. That was where he got to start in killing people. After that, he was then in 1990 working in Argentina as part of the Veterans of the U.S. Dirty War and to advise the IMF stooges that rose to power in its aftermath. This is a reference to a CIA-backed operation to kill any and all members of the Argentinian socialist movement. By what accounting is available, about 30,000 militants, trade unionists, writers, journalists, artists, and civilians were killed as a result of this. Operation Condor is the easiest sort of point of research for this particular activity that Pynchon is referring to there. Another just absolutely horrific bloodbath of intervention that the U.S. was involved in South America as a broader policy of quote unquote suppressing communism, even though this is not. They were mostly socialist, thinkers, and it was mostly popularly elected officials that were attempting to nationalize extraction industries and farming and aspects of their country's economy so that they would be intervention proof, is really what all of this was being done for.
It's where we get the Banana Republic,
which there's also a reference to. There's so much in chapter 10.
Yeah. We're not even out of chapter 10 yet, guys.
No, literally. After that, it says that he was teaching at the School of the Americas. The School of the Americas is a whole other thing as well. This was located at Fort Benning. The School of Americas provides military training to government personnel in Latin American countries. In 1961, it was given the specific purpose of anti-communist counterinsurgency training, It educated several would-be Latin American dictators, their military, and gave tactics and torture. All of this was being put in place in the later CIA coups of Nixon and Reagan. It was really a training ground. This school still exists. It's not called that anymore. The name now is actually something significantly more like, now I gotta look it up. The name of it now is something a lot more like
Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. WINSEC.
Yeah, WINSEC. It's in, who knows what they're doing now. Their modern operations are not really as uncovered as what was going on when it was called the School of Americas, but that gives you an idea of what he was doing. After torturing people in the field, he went back to the country to teach other people to torture people instead of direct assets from the U.S. government. After that, we get a treatment of the fact that Windust owns like a small economy's worth of countries, or a small country's economy's worth of companies and other sort of extraction industry pieces of the pie. This is a real thing. After a lot of this stuff happened, the IMF came in to sort of renegotiate contracts and ownership deals between the dictators and the junta with international corporations. So if your country's economy is owned by several multinational corporations and several different groups of people, it's a lot harder for them to nationalize those things later on down the line should the coup fail to sort of keep steady in the country as far as a guiding hand is concerned. And Windust has been the recipient of a number of those deals. I love the quote on page 109 starting with, "This is fucking appalling." Do you want to read that, Will?
Sure. This is fucking appalling. How does it happen? How does somebody get from entry-level foot soldier to the battered specimen who accused her of their night? This is a text file, no pictures of Mexican see Windust back then. A clean-looking kid, short chinos and button-down shirts, only has to shave once a week. One of a truck gang of young smartasses piling into cities and towns all over the third world, filling ancient colonial spaces with office copiers and coffee machines, pulling all-nighters, running off neatly bound plans for the total obliteration of target countries and their replacement by free market fantasies. Need one of these on everybody's desk by 9 a.m. Andale, andale. Comical Speedy Gonzales dialogue would have been standard among these generally eastern seaboard snot-noses.
Yeah, just a really, really well-written paragraph on, how the intelligence communities work and how it turns normal people into something a bit other than that.
Mm-hmm. I think this is, I really love this back half of this chapter for the way it is showing not just Windust's backstory and giving us an idea of who he is and what he, not necessarily what he stands for, because it's hard to say that he really stands for anything. He's just doing what he does. But it's also, this is also showing the reach and the breadth of American complicity in other governments and how they were handled, and since the Reagan administration, or even further back, if you want to look at it from starting when Nixon and Kissinger were, everything in South America. So there's so much going on that is giving us so much backstory to not just this character, but to the U.S. as a character. Yeah. And how their involvement in so much other parts of the world and meddling in these other governments leads to what is coming in the story.
Absolutely. So did we have any thoughts on Giamara and the fact that they got married, other than kind of the stuff we already talked about kind of at the introduction of his character? I feel like we did a pretty good job kind of breaking down why that might have happened.
I just heard her name means ready for battle, which I thought was interesting. I did not know that.
Oh, that I didn't know.
Yeah, but I thought that was a very fitting name for her. It was one of those, penchant names. I always try to find out what he's doing with them, and that was one that kind of rang pretty well.
Yeah. So this is, I cannot draw any direct lines, but y'all fell into rabbit holes digging into Promise and other documents Pharisees, and I fell into a rabbit hole surrounding the Aravellists, which I can't remember if they're mentioned in this chapter or the next one. And it's just, there's a lot of stuff in this kind of info dump that I to me indicates, in correlation with some of the news that's come out of Central America, in particular Guatemala, in the past 5 years or so. It makes me think that it might be a tip of the hand to something that not be publicly accessible yet. And I'm not going to go into any more details because it will do nothing but put me on more lists and give more listeners a headache.
Can't tease us like that.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's not. I don't have strong theories, but look into Guatemala. Look into recent Guatemalan politics. Look into the things that the U.S. government has said regarding Guatemala and other Central American political exchanges in the past decade or so. Because it's yeah, I mean it's I don't want to make any allegations, especially not to people who might genuinely just be trying their best and might not even be accidentally assets for the CIA. But yeah.
Okay. Well, that's some homework for the listeners then. Look into Guatemala. We do also have a reference to United Fruit. As Cody mentioned, this was a multinational conglomerate that was basically used as a front for purchasing vast swaths of land and farming industry in order to box out legitimate government from nationalizing their industries and other things. It later became the Chiquita Banana Company.
Mm-hmm.
There was a great moment on Twitter shortly after Elon Musk bought it and got rid of all the verifications where people were posting as the Chiquita Banana Company, saying
I remember that.
that they were doing coups again.
Fucking ridiculous.
Did you have any additional information on United Fruit that you wanted to mention, Cody, since you brought it up?
No, I would. We could go on and on about it. I have a feeling this episode's gonna already be up there. I would. It's worth looking into. I think for anyone not familiar with it, I think it lends a lot of context to not just this book, but I think you can also trace it back to. There's parts of it that play into like Vineland and stuff, and just the way in which things were and still are handled with South America, I don't think gets really the attention that it should. There's a lot of questionable activity that goes on through American intervention that doesn't really get the same news play that things in other parts of the world get. So I think there's a lot to mine from there. So do some research. Obviously, try to find reputable sources when you do, but there's a lot to learn about what's going on in there.
Yeah, luckily United Fruit is one of those ones that's pretty just sort of out there in the open now.
Yeah.
And it's not disputed anymore. So after a dizzying array of information on this dossier, Maxine simply is left to wonder why Marvin delivered it to her and what she's supposed to do with it. Do you want to read that last paragraph of chapter 10, Cody, since you love Marvin so much?
Sure. Maxine scrolls onward, but is now focusing more on why did Marvin bring her this in the first place and what she's supposed to do with it. All right. Maybe Marvin is some kind of otherworldly messenger, an angel even. But whatever unseen forces may be employing him at the moment, she's obliged to ask professional questions such as how in secular space might the data storage gizmo have found its way to Marvin? Somebody wants her to see it. Gabriel Ice? Elements in the CIA or whoever? Windust himself? It's a great job of setting up, but what the hell is going on and who is feeding her this information and why?
Mm-hmm. And the thing that I love about this decision by Pynchon too is that some of the stuff with Windust as the book goes on isn't necessarily answered directly on the page. And so he's sort of involving, once again, the reader into Maxine's worldview of asking those questions of, why did this happen? What was going on? Who's responsible for this? I love it anytime an author deliberately tries to pull the reader into the same headspace of Maxine, and Pynchon does that exceptionally well in this book in particular. Do we have any thoughts on chapter 10 before we move on to 11?
Yeah, in just kind of a more general sense, since we've been focusing a lot on the very specifics throughout this conversation so far. Chapter 10, I think, is a really good kind of short summary of one of the many points that this book overall, may or may not be trying, but is making. In particular, with regard to this false dichotomy, which is one of Pynchon's favorite false dichotomies to return to, in especially U.S. American political conversations, there is this very weird attitude of private versus public being a real distinction, and not necessarily in that I'm, say, well, anything that's private can be controlled by the government, or anything that's public, anything that's governmental can be controlled by private interests, although both of those are true. But this info dump and the way that Windust approached Maxine does very well is outline the methods that the U.S. and various other organizations throughout modern history have used privatization or as smokescreens to obscure the actual maneuvers that they are engaging in.
Yeah, that's very, very true. It's a good point. Well, I believe that brings us to chapter 11, and I promise listeners we will not spend nearly as much time on 11 and 12 as we did on 10. It just so happens that this is a case where Pynchon has given us a dossier on a federal agent for the first time in one of his books. Which really gives him quite the excuse to just shove a bunch of stuff in there about how fucked up the U.S. government is. I want to open up the floor here to what everyone thinks the parable that March Kelleher gives at the graduation ceremony means. What are your thoughts on her parable?
So I think the answer to the parable could be, in my opinion, kind of obvious in that I think that the person who tells the parable, what's her name again?
March Kelleher.
Yeah, I think that she could be the old lady, and that Gabriel Ice could be the mayor. Gabriel Ice is shown to be throwing a lot of money around, and she's obviously not fazed by that. I'm not sure if it's a one-to-one comparison, but I do think that that's a possible interpretation, and maybe the interpretation she's looking for, and maybe the parable's not quite as complicated as Maxine and others seem to think it is.
All right. Will, Cody?
I think at least for me, it kind of comes off as the corruptible versus the incorruptible. Who can be bought and who will stand for what it is they believe in, regardless of what's being thrown at them to cave. I think so much in the world in general happens, things that normal people would not normally do tend to happen because someone can pay them enough money.
Right.
It's never power. Power's too much of a valuable asset to give someone. Money is a lot more disposable, a lot easier to come by, and it goes away a lot faster. So its influence and its duration are much smaller. So I think a lot of times with this kind of story, I think what it's looking at is essentially like, who is it that, in your life, the person that's telling you that, who do you know that will stand fast for whatever it is they believe in, and who is going to just cave at, any given price. And I think a lot of times you're going to find it's a lot more of the latter than it is the former, which is sad, but that's how a lot of the really just heinous things that go down especially when you're looking at like the upper echelons of power, like the government and even the people above that. The people with the money are the ones that are able to influence the behavior of the people that they need to influence. And if those people can't get bought, then there are more nefarious things that can be done to keep those people in check or keep them from damaging whatever it is that they might be able to damage. We kind of covered that with chapter 10, but I think ultimately that's what it's getting at is who is corruptible and who is incorruptible.
Yeah. Will, what about you?
My first thoughts go to a mix of the Christ Sophia and the Demiurge, as well as power versus culture, and having those having the characterization of a person who's in charge of a thing versus somebody whose entire modus operandi is to move around and just to grab what can be grabbed, not because they want to control, not because they want to grab, but because someone needs to grab the things. And if as the rag says, forget I cannot and must not forget. She is the cumulative humanity of the city in some ways. And for me, it comes across as either a very spiritual interpretation or as a very abstracted version of like culture as an institution, I guess. Mm-hmm. Not in the modern like culture in the just if you're going to frame things as institutions, culture as one. And I don't draw any concrete meanings out of those things, because I think that if you're the interpretations that Cody and Luke presented are much more productive. But I think that they're all tied in together. And I think that the money versus power distinction is a huge element of this.
Yeah, for sure. Reading through this, my mind is drawn directly to at the end where she says, "Who is this old lady? What does she think she's been finding out all these years? Who's this ruler that she's refusing to be bought off by? And what's his work that he's doing in secret? Suppose the ruler isn't a person at all, but a soulless force so powerful that it cannot ennoble. It does entitle, which in the city nation we speak of is always more than enough." What I was really reminded of after reading this parable this time through was the line from near the end of Vineland about like the cosmic sort of balance of evil forces tipping the scales in one direction, and then a series of small acts by others working to tip the scales back to zero. I feel like this parable is sort of a story of how governments or power becomes corrupted and how they slowly fall prey to doing evil in an ever-increasing capacity, and what the kind of choices from the citizens of those nations can do can hopefully, in one regard or another, fight back against that in this sort of cosmic balancing act that he lays out towards the end of Vineland. Like first the ruler buys silence from those using money, but when someone refuses, he realizes that he has to find some way to silence them, is the wording that's in there, in order for him to remain in power. Prior to this, to silence others, he didn't necessarily kill people. He created webs of spies, and he hired people to become bodyguards to keep an eye on other people, and he created insiders instead of sort of, he tried to flip them to working for him instead of allowing them to continue to disseminate their own information out in public. Rather than criticize the regime freely, I'm just going to give them a job. They're going to work for me, and now they're part of the power apparatus. And so therefore the corruption spreads, and you need more handlers, you need more operations, you need more money to keep track of this ever-widening group that continues to exercise more of whatever the ruler is doing. And so lastly, we arrive at this one person who remains incorruptible. I feel like this is almost pinch on saying that is the duty of not necessarily his readers, but the people of these nations to try and remain incorruptible in their own right, to be the forces who are trying to tip the scale back by not allowing these people to be bought off, by not allowing their silence to be purchased, and that the cost of silence overall is far more than what a ruler can imagine. And it specifically singles out the fact that, you know, she continued speaking, and so the dark deeds of the ruler spread into the public consciousness of the nation. And so this idea of, like, you know, if you can resist power, if you can resist the buy-off, if you can resist the money, you know, and those twin forces, then in theory, what is being done in the dark will be brought to the light, to put it in a very, you know, perhaps haughty phrase. And this is kind of why I feel like Bleeding Edge is sort of Pynchon's final words. This is one of those sections where I feel like he's really trying to say that, like, I've talked about this stuff for a long time, and so I'm just gonna put it on here in really plain language for you to see and understand, and hopefully take to heart that this is kind of what is necessary. You need to do your best to be one of these people who allows the dark misdeeds to remain in the public consciousness and to not be forgotten.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. And I think it's got to be really frustrating, especially for someone like him, to see the way things have gone and the way things could go, especially at this time. And
especially
I think that's why
post 9/11, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's why you get that line just after Maxine's speech a couple pages later, where she talks about the idealism of the youth and how the youth movement at that time. She said, you know, I haven't seen anything like it since the 60s. These kids are out to change the world. And she's right, but you know, kind of like we talked about, I think at the beginning of this season, the internet absolutely had that capacity. Like it really could have been a platform on which information could be disseminated freely and out of the reach of the powers that wanted to keep it out of reach. They stopped it, though. I think that it got to a point where they saw that coming and found ways to keep that from happening. I also think we did it to ourselves. I think we, and the Josh Harris documentary shows that, like, we lost focus, and again, just exacting like what happened in the 60s. The drive was there, the passion was there, the opportunity was there, and we got in our own way. And it's just another, you know, it is so disheartening to just, I think, as for me, it's disheartening enough to look back at it at a time that I wasn't alive and see it sputter out like it did, and to a lesser degree in the 80s again. But I mean, if you put yourself in Pynchon's shoes, like that speech rings a lot harder when he's lived through it twice.
Right.
And,
yeah.
You know, and it's just a constant. Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, this is his, like, shoving the book in our face. Like, look, I've told you, I don't know what else I can do. Like, I've told you, I've shown you, it's all there. Like, I've been putting it in there. You guys have, you know, the information is there for you to go. Yes, you have to go look for it, but it's all there. And, you know, and I think this might, you know, that might have been our last chance to really push back at that power and really make an impact on it. And instead we used it to, you know, build these ostentatious reality platforms that we just wanted to show every moment of our lives on, and seek this fleeting moment of fame rather than make an actual impact on something like that. So I don't know, it's frustrating. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I think that, you know, and I think, like Will said, the dichotomy of money and power is especially relevant with what Pynchon has lived through twice, because in the 60s it was power. It was, you know, we'll flip people to be internal investigators, and then we'll just give them jobs. It was like when the program Brock was working on got wrapped up because people just wanted to work for the government after all of it got, you know, dissolved. And then, like you said, with We Live in Public is a perfect example of that, as it became entertainment rather than, you know, a sense of power, and the money that can be made from entertainment, from broadcasting yourself, or from, you know, being online and being viral. And that's still what it is to this day.
Mm-hmm.
I would be really curious to hear Pynchon's thoughts on Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah.
Because that really feels like an inflection point with the generation in particular that March is talking about. But that was infiltrated from like the very beginning, and they were all being tracked from the very beginning of that, which was came out afterwards. And then that spiraled out into, what if we turn this into an entertainment spectacle online? We'll record all of this, and we'll have people came down to the park to argue with the protesters, and that was turned into viral videos on YouTube and all of that. And it turned the whole thing into a spectacle rather than focusing on the actual initial reason why they were in the park in the first place. It's very interesting, especially looking back on it now in 2024 from the perspective of it being published in 2013, because we talked about that with Gen Z back when we were doing Vineland, which is obviously the generation after the one that March is talking about. And, all of their stuff is still disseminated. All that stuff we were talking about is still disseminated through Twitter and TikTok. And there's still that incentive of money from a viral perspective with all of that. And now, ironically, the government's trying to ban TikTok.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a great inclusion here. And I do love the Pynchonian element of March doing this to a class of 8th graders.
Yeah.
That's pretty great.
Who have got to be just absolutely confused as to what it is.
Yeah. It's the freaking graduating class speech. And then I also love her words like, oh yeah, you can just get a pizza if you figure out the answers to these questions.
With whatever you want on it.
Yeah, pizza with whatever you want.
Well, and I want to zero in on the line after she's done with the actual allegory, where she says, "Suppose the ruler isn't a person at all, but a soulless force so powerful that thought cannot ennoble. That though it cannot ennoble, it does entitle, which in the city nation we speak of is always more than enough." And I think from the perspective of Mark as a character, it's pretty clear that one very obvious interpretation is capital. Is the man.
Yeah. Yep.
But beyond that, I think it's evocative of the origin of consciousness in the bicameral mind, which, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a work of 70s era consciousness theory, I guess, where the scholar
easiest way to describe it.
Yeah, Julian Jaynes was this scholar who basically used that due to a combination of people experiencing schizophrenia and various other issues with the individuals mistook their emotional, individuals identified with their emotional state, which is associated with the right side of the brain, and the logical language handling side of the brain, which is associated with the left side, what was not integrating really. And so modern religions, in his theory, and the way that we think about consciousness all stem from people interpreting their thoughts as external to them, and various other wrinkles in that. And there's just something about the choice of ennoble versus entitle that, while it can be viewed as, hey, in capitalism, in this framework, it happens after feudalism, where there is no longer ennoblement, but there is entitlement, literally, to the deed of property. Whereas, in this loose association from origins of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind, ennoblement would be the feeling of being a person versus entitlement being having the words for it.
Yeah, that's a great piece to that. Not that I would anticipate any listeners to read this book because it's incredibly long and hard to read, but
and
Capital in the 21st Century. Yeah, also that, yes. Well, no, not what you're saying. What I'm saying, I would also recommend reading Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. Oh, yeah. If you're just really interested in what Will's talking about with capital as a concept and its development and all of that. But that's quite a project to take on yourself if you want to read it.
Yeah, what I thought you were is don't go out and read The Origin of consciousness and down to the bicameral mind, which, yeah, don't do that.
I mean, you
Go
could.
read
That's
Piketty
also a
if you
good
want.
book. Or you could just read both of them if you truly want to fully explore this concept.
If you want us to be around for the next year.
Yeah, that's fair. Or if you just want to become like the hosts of your favorite podcast. Oh man. So after this this graduation speech, Maxine decides that she's going to go talk to March, and the two of them make a lunch date. Well, not a lunch date, because that's an invention of late stage capitalism, a breakfast date. And they go to a Greasy Spoon diner. Another possible Seinfeld reference is the fact that Maxine orders cereal at this restaurant, which Jerry orders cereal at the diner in Seinfeld all the time.
Yeah, he just eats cereal in Seinfeld all the time.
That's also true. He's got like 10 boxes of cereal in his apartment permanently,
Cereal's
which I don't.
good.
It is good, but I've never ate so much cereal that I would need that many boxes of cereal.
Yeah.
And this is where we get some more backstory on specifically March's relationship with her son-in-law Gabriel Ice and her daughter who married him. There's some interesting stuff in here again about the youth. That quote comes from this conversation that we already kind of talked about, but there's also a line in here about these men of vision. They dream about Central Park West to Fifth Avenue, solid with gracious residences. That ended up happening. That's exactly what happened there. That's what happened with the rest of the city. Some more narratives that Pynchon is drawing about gentrification. As they continue to talk, it turns out that March is just as interested in Hashslingers as a potentially corrupt entity as Maxine is, but she doesn't have the ability to investigate it in the way that Maxine does, because she doesn't, have those tools and resources that fraud investigators do. So Maxine kind of gives her a overall kind of gestalt of where she's at. March mentions a quote here. This is, Hashslingers is as tight as it gets with the U.S. security apparatus, an arm of, if you like, crypto work, countermeasures, heaven knows what all. This would make them an inside firm, as they're kind of called, where they're basically contracted by the government to do work for the government, where the government needs deniability, but basically the company can't live without the government. A lot of the NSA spying stuff that happened with PRISM and all of that was done using inside firms. Snowden famously said that he spent almost no time inside the NSA building. It was all different inside companies that he was actually technically working with through contracted work. I do also love the quote on page 117 where it says, I see my share of conspiracy theories. Some are patently bullshit. Some I want to believe so much I have to be careful. Others are inescapable even if I wanted to escape. I feel like that's just such a great breakdown of conspiracy theories as a cultural aspect of what people post online and all of that, which obviously she's kind of a precursor of at this time. Then there's some mentions here of the fact that Gabriel Ice is super into the Montauk Project. Was it episode 2 where I gave the overview on the Montauk Project stuff, Cody, just in case the listeners want to go back to it?
I believe that's right.
Yeah, so if you want to hear more about the Montauk Project, I won't waste time by going through it again. You can hear our thoughts on that in the episode on chapters 3 through 6. But they give a little bit of an overview there in that paragraph. And we also learn that this sort of stuff isn't public knowledge yet. That line about Bill Gates loves boats, but Larry Ellison races yachts. Bill Gross collects stamps. But this, what Forbes would probably call passion of ISIS, isn't too widely known yet. So it's managed to be kind of kept a secret. She also refers to him as a power-hungry little CIA groupie jerk-off. This is, again, another place where I could say that there might be some comparisons between him and Josh Harris, given Josh Harris's background from his family and the fact that he had a CIA therapist and the stuff with the bee thing and gelatin that we have already talked about. There's also a mention in here to TWA Flight 800. This is a whole nother rabbit hole you can go down if you want to. Basically, a plane exploded 30 minutes into its journey. And a lot of people on the ground said that they witnessed a streak of light moving upwards until the fireball appeared in the sky. A a lot of people suggested that a missile was shot at it, that it was either a case of like a terrorist attack or the government shooting a plane down. The most common theory was that there was a military exercise going on with the Navy and they accidentally shot the plane down. And because of the fact that Clinton was undergoing his re-election campaign at the time, they didn't want to focus on that. And so they just decided to kind of cover it up and bury it. The official explanation is that there was a buildup of jet fuel vapors in the gas tank in the center of the plane, and that the wiring from the computer console that read the fuel gauge was arcing. They found like an issue with that wiring system was actually giving off arcs and flashes, and so it ignited a buildup of vapors and it caused the plane to explode. That was the official story.
Mm-hmm.
After
There's
the
a lot of
investigation,
weird kind of stuff that went on with that, though. Like they did find like trace elements of various explosives and
nitroglycerin specifically.
Nitroglycerin was the big one, yeah. And then there was like some like red-brown residue or something on the seats that they couldn't really account for, and
the FBI had a criminal investigation along with it at the same time. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff took out a full-page ad in the New York Times claiming that the investigation's findings were wrong and that they needed to reopen the investigation.
I remember that when that happened. I was watching on the news when like the survivors' families were showing up at the hotels around where they were investigating, and it was wild.
It's a really big deal for a long time. In fact, 50% of the U.S. population, by a survey that I found in the research I did in TWA, did not believe the actual story that was presented to them about it.
Yep.
And it's just sort of been one of those things where nobody has actually believed what occurred. And like several of the investigating agencies that were invited into the investigation by the NWTA, I believe is the organization that did they didn't agree on a lot of the facts of it. They didn't agree on it. There was a lot of like inter-investigatory fighting as well. It's a very weird thing.
That's something interesting, I think, where this is when you're looking at these kind of things through a conspiratorial lens, there's a real kind of 50-50 in some situations, and I think this might be one of them, where either what happened is not what they're telling us happened, or what they're telling us happened did happen. They just fucked up so bad that no one believes the actual events that occurred because of internal fighting, because of bad communication, like whatever the case may be. It gets hard in certain situations like this to really figure out what actually happened, because it's either one of those two things. Either one is almost equally plausible.
Right. And the weirdest aspect of that case that I could find is that somebody not believing the findings of the report did a Freedom of Information Act request on it, and a guy named I wrote his name down somewhere. He basically did a FOIA request for a bunch of documents on how the investigators calculated the actual like flight path and explosion vector to come up with the computer model of what happened, like when they were presenting their findings to the court. And the DOJ and the investigatory body lost all the documents that he requested. Like they fought his request in court for a really long time. And then eventually the court were like, you have to give this to him. He's making a completely valid legal claim, but you don't have to give him everything because some of these documents are overreaching, but you have to give him like this list. And then sure enough, all of those documents were lost that the guy was looking for. And it's one of those cases too, where unlike something like with Promise, where the software has like legitimate sort of intelligence capabilities, there's no reason necessarily that the government would blow up an airplane. So the whole thing is just kind of confusing and weird. But that's the story there, which they're relating back to the Montauk Project in the book as like a potential weapons experiment.
And I do love the line in here after the mention of TWA Flight 800 where she says, if you were doing something in secret and didn't want the attention, what better way to have it ridiculed and dismissed than bring in a few Californian elements?
Yeah. Yep.
Which is essentially like if you can get them asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers.
Yep.
It's that same kind of thing.
If you make it weird enough, then people will start to disbelieve it.
Well, you would think, but nowadays, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe in 2013 that was the case, but nowadays not so much. There's also in this conversation a reference to the fact that Maxine has figured out where all of the money is actually going in Dubai. It's going to a place called the Jebel Ali Free Zone. This is also a real thing. This is a free economic zone in Abu Dhabi that is currently host to 9,500 companies that sit there to run money through and take advantage of the lowered taxes and lowered economic regulations around having their companies headquartered there. So that is just another like interesting wrinkle in the whole thing that Thomas Pynchon is pulling from real life. And then after all of this, we get to the fact that March has a strained relationship with Talus, and this is just hard stuff to read.
Yeah.
It's just sad that any parent would have this strained of a relationship with their child. There's a quote here on 119 that I really love where it says, "She looks almost embarrassed, and Maxine's mom, ESP, cranking into action now, tells her this will not be unconnected with Talus. The child March is not shy about admitting she once literally prayed to have the one she misses most of all, living over on the Upper East Side, just across from the park, but it might as well be Kathmandu. Also, Society Lady, a kid of her own that March seldom, if ever, sees, lost Talus, bought and sold into a world March will never give up her hatred of." Like, it's bad enough that you would lose your relationship with your kid, but to lose it in that way, where she's become, this high society member of everything that you've kind of strove to fight against in your, I don't know if I'll say professional life, but basically professional life is just, it's very tragic. And March asked Maxine to go talk to Talus to get information on Hashslingers, but it's really just because she wants to know how her daughter's doing.
A welfare check, yeah. That's
yeah, absolutely. Which lends the whole next chapter with an additional air of sadness when Maxine does actually sit down with her. Do we have any extra thoughts from chapter 11 before going into 12?
I would like to draw a connection between the relationship between March and Talus and Sasha and Nessie. They're clearly not similar characters, but the relationships between the mother-daughters are. It's it's a different kind of magic, because Sasha, as she doesn't or didn't approve of what Fernesi doing, she could confidently say, hey, even if Fernesi is giving into her baser instinct, if you want to phrase it that way for some reason, she's doing what she wants, right? Fernesi, up until the point where she got out of the re-education camp, was estranged from her mother only because she was off doing her own thing. And in this case, you have Talus being estranged based on a system that March clearly seems as purely coercive with no human sincerity behind it. And it just did, I don't know, framing it that magnifies the tragedy, to me at least.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. It's really sad.
Yeah.
And just one you go ahead.
No, I was going to wrap it up. Go ahead.
I was going to add for a lighter diver. Larry Ellison races yachts and Bill Gross collects stamps. These are both true facts about those public figures. Also, obviously, Lotfine has meant that every time Pynchon brings up stamps, I have to divert us back to that. I don't see any.
Pynchon collects stamps?
Oh.
Very possible. But Vilgross and Pierce rarity. The only similarity between them broadly is that Pierce is also in it's a different kind of investment. So I was curious if you had any thoughts of what characters might be racing yachts in by Pynchon that are not actually racing yachts, because I don't think there are any of those except for actually the one, but he's not really a villain.
That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that line in synchronicity with the rest of Pynchon's work. I had taken it just kind of on the face value of like, it would be awkward if this was the thing that people knew about Gabriel Ice. I'd have to think about that. That's
I can't think
that's
of
a good
anything
call out.
Well, hopefully it's just a sweeter taste to leave in the mouth of the listeners than March and Talus's estrangement, which is just sad.
Yeah,
there's nothing
it is
fun to do there.
Yeah, late Pynchon is really good at writing the tragic family stuff. So Talus returns from their home in Montauk and is able to fit Maxine into her schedule. So Maxine goes on a harrowing cab ride
Jesus
across the city to get there. We get another example of the kind of gentrification taking place where it says whose drivers suffer or enjoy a hostility level comparable to that of Maxine's driver here, not to mention police barricades. Form single file lines, jackhammer crews, backhoes and front end loaders, cement mixers, asphalt spreaders, and battered dump trucks unmarked by any contractor's name, let alone phone number. Just that continuous just development and building and gentrification is surrounding her everywhere that she goes.
Mm-hmm.
Did we have any thoughts on the cab driver and the fact that he seems to retire in the middle of their cab ride?
Like in a very threatening way too. Like, I have to begin the process. I keep putting it off, but I'm out of time. Today's the day. We don't just get scooped up like fish in a net. We know it's coming. We have to prepare. That sounds like somebody who has bought into the Book of Revelation like way too literally, and is just readying himself for the moment that rapture happens. And he's decided it's now.
I it feels important, but I'm not sure what this would be getting at, other than just at a certain point, every cab driver's had enough and decides they're done driving a cab.
Yeah. That's about all I could get out of it.
Well, we could turn to get your theories about this being a farewell book.
Oh.
But no, I other than kind of very peachy interpretation, I don't have things from it.
I'm a fan of that personally. Maybe because I'm biased, because it confirms my suspicions. But it would be
I can see it.
It would be a cool inclusion. Yeah, just that someday the day comes when you have to stop writing and Pynchon. This is it.
That's it.
Yeah.
Bye.
And much like, this is not the last page of the book. Like Maxine is not at her destination when she gets this speech. He keeps putting it off.
True.
It's coming. He has to prepare, and it's threatening. But you're sticking around till the end of the book because otherwise you wouldn't have gotten your worth.
Very, very true. Yeah. So Maxine elects to just walk the rest of the way. I love the idea of her being so off put by this cabbie that she's like, I think I'm just gonna walk.
Yeah.
I'm gonna deal with all the construction sounds.
That's enough.
I'm good here.
I mean, well, serious. I can't. Can you imagine sitting down in a cab? The driver immediately starts going on a racist rant targeting your ethnic group.
Right.
And then starts talking, needing to prepare for. It seems like his particular interpret of the Book of Revelation is much closer to like a Wahhabist jihad idea than any Christian idea. Like I would get him if I were Maxine.
Yeah.
I literally wrote "Get Out" in my book right next to that.
As someone who's been on the receiving end of anti-Semitic rants, you kind of just want to get out of there as soon as possible. So she eventually finds herself at the home of Gabriel Ice and his wife Talus, which is multiple floors of the building they live in.
Mm-hmm.
And we're treated to a description, as I said at the beginning of the show, not unlike the vastness of Muad'Dib's throne room in Dune Messiah. Just littered with expensive works of art and this massive grand piano. And just all of these beautiful appointments. I love the description of Talus on page 124, the paragraph starting with Talus has perfected. Does someone want to read that paragraph?
I've got it right here. Talus has perfected the soap opera trick of managing through all the daylight hours to look turned out for evening activities. High-end makeup, hair in a tousled bob with every strand expensively disarranged, taking its time whenever she gestures with her head to slide back into its artful confusion. Black silk slacks and a matching top unbuttoned halfway down, which Maxine thinks she recognizes from the Narciso Rodriguez spring collection. Italian shoes that only once a year are found on sale at prices humans can afford, some humans. Emerald earrings, weighing in at half a carat each. Hermes watch, Art Deco ring of Golconda diamonds, which every time she passes through the sunlight coming up at the window flares into a nearly blinding white, like a superheroine's magical flashbang for discombobulating the bad guys. It's a great just description of this, and especially being preceded by all the the essentially meaningless art that her and Gabriel have clearly paid a lot of money for, and just it is nothing but an empty status symbol. I mean it does a great job of telling us who this person is.
Yeah, well,
and at least who she's putting on to be.
True. Well, and I love that they own multiple Cy Twombly drawings, which if you've not seen what those look like, listeners, just Google them.
Or just write a few words on a piece of paper and then start to erase them. And that's...
Well, not only that, but they're kind of known for being purchased as a status symbol rather than there being any interest in actual art. So it really does show, like, not just their mentality, but kind of the mentality of the yuppies versus the wasps, and that, like, we're going to own this as the perceived status it provides us rather than, being anything of actual discernible value, really.
Yeah, and I love the detail that she's not just all the designer accessories, but she's wearing the most generic looking clothes that would, I think, also be like the least comfortable, because New York City is not like it gets cold, but it's a pretty humid city. There's not like a lot of breeze. I cannot imagine walking around draped in silk. That sounds like hell.
It is springtime at least, so it's not like it's still cold up there.
True, yeah.
It's starting to warm up, so.
Well, it kind of reminds me of, I forgot, there's an account on Instagram that I can't remember the name of that specifically analyzes photographs of like the super rich wearing what look to be like regular clothes that you'd buy at like a Kohl's or whatever, and showing you what the actual price tags of them are, where like this brown sweater or whatever that Mark Zuckerberg is wearing that looks like it should cost $15 is actually like $586.
Yeah. Like Kanye's $800 white t-shirt.
Yeah, there you go. That's a really good one. And just this kind of idea that like when you become that ultra rich, the status symbol is not really what your clothes look like, it's who's making them. And you look like you're dressed normally, but your outfit is actually gonna cost $5,000 for you to put on or whatever. But yeah, that's a really good call out, Will. I hadn't necessarily considered that until you brought it up. If we get some backstory with Talus and Gabriel Ice, I also, the constant Alvin and the Chipmunks jokes through this interaction, simply because of the fact that Talus has a high-pitched voice. It feels like you're in Maxine's head as she can't stop having like intrusive thoughts.
Unhear it.
Yeah. Where they met at Carnegie Mellon, about as waspy as it gets.
Yep.
Gabriel's roommate was a guy named Dieter who was majoring in bagpipes.
A real thing. That is 100% legitimate. I looked it up. They still offer that.
That's so stupid to go get a major in. Unless you're going to become like...
If you can afford a Cy Twombly in your house, you can afford to major in bagpiping.
That's true. Is
the same Dieter as Mason? Was this a real man, or was it just a ghost?
He's an immortal bagpiper.
That would make honestly a lot of sense given the noise on that side of St.
Reversing the
Helena.
timelines.
Yeah. And so Gabe just kind of started spending a lot of time in Talus's dorm simply because his roommate was practicing the bagpipes all of the time. And then again, another Josh Harris connection. If you watched We Live in Public, you know that Josh Harris was like a TV addict and was a TV addict specifically for, like Gilligan's Island and a lot of stuff like that. Gabriel Ice rather, also sort of got addicted to TV because he had nothing else to do. So he was just sitting there, as it says, he quickly slipped into a tube-lit cluster geek existence, often unsure if he was awake or dreaming in REM, which might have accounted for his early conversations with Talus, which he remembers nowadays as unusual, where he's like literally mistaking her for the women that he's watching on television because he's ingesting so much media content that he can't tell the difference between reality and otherwise anymore. So just another interesting Josh Harris connection with that character. And this is when Maxine reveals that March is her quote-unquote neighbor. And the actual reason that she's here is not due to that, but rather because she's interested about hashslingers and about what might be sort of going on there, given that she is the comptroller for the company. After they kind of talk about the estrangement between March and Talus, which again, it's very sad, and it's so realistic too. Yeah. Like that I think is the hardest part about it, is it doesn't seem dramatized or anything. It's just, yeah, this happens to families every day, and it's just translated here. There's another interesting portion here where Maxine asks who does their auditing, and then she responds in a bunch of question marks. So again, I don't know if that's a case where, like with the stringer from Hagawach, if Pynchon is trying to denote a California connection, but it is something that I picked up on there. Turns out that the company they use to do their auditing is pretty legit. The SEC is a big fan of them, but that does not stop Talus from understanding that there may be some weird stuff going on with where the money is going. And she's just as suspicious as, Maxine and Reg and all of them are, but she's in a position where she can't really do much about it because as March revealed in the previous chapter, the prenup they have has so many clauses in it that basically Gabriel Ace owns her. And I understand that she's kind of presented as being stupid. I don't think Talus is actually stupid.
Don't think she is. I think she's playing at
exactly. Because I think that if she was actually stupid, she wouldn't be able to kind of negotiate having Maxine work for her without admitting to anything in the conversation, which she doesn't. She doesn't explicitly say or admit anything.
I think Talus feels very much like a femme fatale. Like, she knows a lot more than she's letting on, and she's very, very aware of what it is she's doing. I do think she's kind of trapped in the situation she's in. Yep. Being with Gabriel Ice and everything. But I do think she is she's very much putting on a sort of facade here and trying to keep some sort of, I guess in a way keep her playing her cards close to her chest.
Yeah, definitely. Especially because she says "poibwem." Like that's too overdone.
It's that intentional infantilism is too on the nose. Yeah.
Yeah. For someone to say, maybe would it be a poibwem if we didn't?
The Shirley Temple hair toss and everything. Yeah, she's very much Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity. Like, she's very aware of what's going on, what she's doing. Yeah. Yeah,
and so this is the newest job offer that Maxine has gotten since this book began, where she wants her to look into the company as well. But before Maxine realizes that she's being suckered, because she does say, feeling all at once in this obscenely overpriced interior, like so totally a sucker, Is Maxine slowing down? Okay, maybe she can invoice this virtual bimbo any fee she wants to, the price of a high-ticket vacation far away, but not till later, deep in the winter months as she relaxes on a tropical beach, while the rum concoction in her tall frosted glass suddenly curdle in her hand as crashing in on her too late, there arrives a freak wave of understanding. Nothing in this fateful moment is what it seems. I love that realization in the way that it's written. It's another one of those moments where just his detective or his hard-boiled writing is just genius. And so she decides that she needs to feign in a business meeting at Smith and Walensky, which is a real steakhouse. That she's going to go. But she says that she'll call if she has any information for her. And then she briefly drops back in on March to tell her about kind of the conversation they had. We also are told that they are sending Gabriel Ice and Talos are sending their child to a polytechnic school, which are like elite sort of not necessarily boarding schools, but like elite
like
private
all around,
schools for
wide education.
Yeah, training like the future elite 1%ers.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, the kind of people that they will be. And so we get another really just sort of sad interaction where March is trying to break through the ice, so to speak, by creating a relationship with her grandson. And all she can really do is wait for him to leave the school before the driver picks him up. And it's just like it
sucks.
It's hard to read, and it's harder to think about just this poor woman doing anything she can to have a relationship with her children and grandchildren. There's a lot of sadness in there as she passes off those Pokemon cards and then reveals that the driver's showing up earlier now. Yeah. Yep. And then we end up back at Maxine's place where Horst can't find his ice cream flavor. And then Cody's favorite character shows up, and
just conveniently with that. Hey,
he's got his chocolate peanut butter cookie dough.
You guys like this ice cream, right?
Oh man! And then also delivers a VHS tape. But it is not revealed what's on the VHS tape in this chapter, so we will not talk about it.
It's not Scream
later.
Blackula Scream though.
It's not Scream Blackula Scream.
Sadly.
It's something entirely different. But Maxine owns Scream Blackula Scream already, apparently.
The director's cut, nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. And that closes out chapter 12. Any other thoughts on chapter 12 before we start to wrap up?
This is a bit random, and it's neither here nor there, not super important, but I do think that it was a thing where the Psyduck card was only available in, like it said in the book, like only certain arcades and like vending machines in Tokyo. I'm pretty sure I remember that being an actual thing from the late 90s, where that card, or the early 2000s, where that card really was only available in those places.
That wouldn't surprise me. Those things got wild, and they still do. Like, that's still Pokemon cards is like a currency is still very much a thing.
Yeah, it's had a huge resurgence in the last 3 years.
It seems like it's died down because like both of my kids for a while there, and when they were both in elementary school, were constantly collecting the cards, and I would hear all the things about, oh yeah, so and so gave so and so this card, and then they gave him this card, blah. And it was, I mean, it got to like the school had to ban them because it was just getting out of hand. So it's not even like these kids weren't even collecting them because it's a game. It's like Magic the Gathering. Like it's an actual like tabletop card game that you can play, but no one ever did that. They just traded them.
I've never seen someone play Pokemon as a card game.
I have not either. I only know this because I was looking at them one time and I was like, these have like the same, because I used to play Magic and I was like, these have like HP markers and like they tell you like they have abilities, and my son's like, yeah, but we don't play. We just trade them with each other. Like, okay.
Yeah, they in my elementary schools, because I was going to school around, a few years after this book, they banned them from my school when, ironically, we only played Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! But, story
Oh, so
of
you actually
people
played it?
being stolen. I never did,
Yeah.
but yeah. Like, I did later, but yeah. I know people who did. I know people who still do. I don't understand it. It's not a very good game, which is honestly why people don't play it. But
Maybe.
I'm currently falling into a rabbit hole regarding LVMH trying to purchase Hermes. I think there might be something going on here because there's a lot of Hermes being mentioned in these last 2 chapters. And there's a lot of LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Moet, and Hennessy brands that are mentioned as well. And it makes me, especially given that Joshua Harris, the last-ditch attempt at funding Pseudo.com and his other projects was to go to LVMH and get a loan from them. It maybe there's something about basically them not even being just like the symbols of yuppiedom, but genuinely being like posers of not actually owning this art, just being the people holding it.
Interesting.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, a lot of these .com guys were not as wealthy as their reported figures were.
No.
Were
Well, it wasn't even real
supposed to
money.
be.
It's all
Yeah, that's
hypothetical money.
also true. It's all
money.
monopoly money. So that would make sense. That's a good spot, Will. I didn't notice that. Well, if there's nothing else, that brings us to funny parts. Is there any that we missed as we were covering through the chapters?
I'm honestly surprised that we skipped over Maxine's true New York experience on 128. A few years back, one bleak winter afternoon on the way home from Pioneer Market on Columbus, some faceless yuppie shoved past March saying, "Excuse me," which in New York translates to "get the fuck out of my way," and which turned out to finally be once too often. March dropped the bag she was carrying in a filthy slush on the street, gave him a good kick, and screamed as loud as she could, "I hate this miserable shithole of a city." Nobody seemed to take notice, though the bags and their strewn contents were gone in seconds. The only reaction was from a passerby who paused to remark, "So, you don't like it? Why don't you go live somewhere else?"
That's good.
100% New York.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I forgot about that too.
And that was March. I'm sorry, not Maxine. It was March.
Yeah, and I also love that section is opened by the narrator saying March is in the process of delivering another commencement speech, meaning she's commencing to leave the city. Oh my god, yeah, that's great.
I did also I won't read the section, but I did also like the fact that Ernie would tell scary blacklist stories to his kids at night.
Yeah, that's also pretty good too. I hate that I lived in the same city that freaking the HUAC guy is from. I can't remember his name right now.
McCarthy?
Yes.
Yeah. Joseph McCarthy.
Yeah, he's from Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's not very proud.
No. The city of Appleton that I lived in for many years is home to 3 figures of note. One is Joseph McCarthy, one is Harry Houdini, and the third is Willem Dafoe.
Wow. You got 2 good ones in there at least.
Yeah, two good ones. Oh, okay. So that I think brings us to quotes. Who wants to go first?
I'm going with on page 101 after the page break. It doesn't seem to be up to Maxine, however. Next day, evening rush hour, it's just starting to rain. Sometimes she can't resist. She needs to be out in the street. What might only be a simple point on the workday cycle, the reconvergence of what the day scattered as Sappho in some place back in college course, Maxine forgets, becomes a million pedestrian dramas, each one charged with mystery, more intense than high barometer daylight can ever allow. Everything changes. There's that clean, rained-on smell. The traffic noise gets liquefied. Reflections from the street into the window of city buses fills the bus interiors with unreadable 3D images, as surface unaccountably transforms to volume. Average pushy Manhattan schmucks crowding the sidewalks also pick up some depths, some purpose. They smile, they slow down, even with a cellular phone stuck in their ear, they are more apt to be singing to somebody than yakking. Some are observed taking houseplants for walks in the rain. Even the lightest umbrella to umbrella contact can be erotic. And that happens right before Maxine meets up with Windust, which really adds so much ambience and feeling to that scene. It's absolutely beautiful scene setting. I love the sort of music quality that the streets have, and the way that they're painted with a life that only comes out when it's raining, which doesn't really get portrayed well enough often enough.
Yeah, true. Especially with that last line of umbrella to umbrella contact potentially being erotic, and then the undertones of Maxine's internal struggle with finding him attractive. I love that section as well. My quote is from page 115. It's the quote is the paragraph just before they meet up for breakfast the next morning between March and Maxine, where it says, "She's smiling, however, it occurs to Maxine that, contrary to the speech she just gave, March isn't a crone, she's a dumpling, with the face and demeanor of somebody who you know within 5 minutes of meeting them will be telling you to eat something specific, which she will have on a spoon, already on its way to your mouth." Real simple one for me, in contrast to what I normally pick, but I love that quote so much because it reveals so much about who that character is, especially as a precursor to the scene that's going to follow it, where you learn the history of the issues between Talus and March. You know, this woman who runs basically a version of InfoWars, and, you know, walks around wearing military fatigues and delivering these complicated parables to you know, these 8th graders in an effort to kind of give them some radical education. She's still just a mother, and I love the way Maxine sees that as, like, at her core, she's going to be someone forcing you to eat, and that just says so much about who that character really is in a way that I find really compelling.
Yeah,
we've already met most of the quotes I would have picked. So I'm sorry for making you go for again, Cody.
No worries.
But
I forgive you.
Thank you. So I think I'll have to settle for just the scene set on page 122. Park Ave, despite attempts at someone's idea of beautification, has remained, for all but the chronically clue-free, the most boring street in the city. Built originally as a kind of genteel lid to cover up the train tracks running into Grand Central, what should it be? The Champs-Élysées? Sped through at a nice stretch limo, let's say, on the Harlem, it might register as durable. In broad daylight, however, at an average speed of 1 block per hour, jammed with loud and toxic-smelling traffic, all in advance of disrepair, whose drivers suffer or enjoy a hostility level comparable to that of Maxine's driver here, not police barricades, formal lane signs, jack-crews, backhoes, and loaders, cement mixtures, asphalt spreaders, and battered dump trucks unmarked by any contractor's name, let alone phone number. It becomes an occasion for spiritual exercise, though maybe more Eastern type than anything connected with this radio station, blasting some kind of Christian what? No, I don't want to know. It's a really beautiful fusion of you know, the Pynchon list and just wonderful, like, New York City centered as well as Maxine characterization. I don't know if there's a better example of his evolution as a writer than the way that genuinely part of what's going on instead of just being descriptive.
That's a good point.
I also love the mention of Christian hip hop.
Oh yeah, Toby Mac. Yeah.
AJ52, hell yeah.
Oh yeah.
All right, heck yeah. Sorry, I am terribly sorry.
Luke, what quote do you have?
Yeah, so I'm not going to read my quote because it's the entirety of the parable, and that's like 2 pages, 2.5 pages.
Sure.
I'm not going to read all of it, but that's probably my favorite passage in this book so far. In terms of, I really have always loved the stories within the story in Pynchon novels, especially Mason and Dixon. And yeah, that's probably my choice for quote, but it's a little bit too long to read all of it.
Makes sense. Most Pynchon part of the chapter?
Oh, for me, it's the token joke at the beginning of chapter 12, where she's with what the hell is his name? her
Sean.
therapist, Sean. Who it just says, maybe not. What do you think Dogen would do? Sit after what seems like a good part of the hour has ticked away. Sit, yes, and just sit.
I love that inclusion of most of the hour.
Yeah. Just a reminder that this guy has no actual concept of what he's talking about, and he's just, borrowing from Eastern philosophy and Buddhism to just, it's the fancy thing to do. It's the bougie thing to do at the time. So, that little throwaway joke I thought was really clever.
Yeah, it is. It is. My most pinch on part of the chapter, or I would. It's hard for me not to say the name drop of promise, and just I think that might be me trying to justify how much time I spent reading about it. But the fact that he includes so much history in 2 sentences or whatever it is, and obviously comes from a wide swath of research and knowledge that he's putting into the book. I would say that strikes me as distinctly Pinchonian.
My most mentioned part is probably the appearance of Marvin with the discontinued ice cream at the end of chapter 12, which is just like, I often say this for this part, but I can't think of any other author that would include like, a perhaps magical bike messenger, bike delivery guy showing up with, discontinued ice cream just because the ex-husband is fiending for it.
Mm-hmm.
I like that part a lot, and it's just it's nice and random and cool, and I just really enjoy it. And it just strikes me that not a lot of other authors it wouldn't occur to them to even include something like that.
For sure.
Yeah, very true. William?
Well, I don't have anything novel.
Is that a pun?
Nope. But I just, it's hard for me to pick anything except for the chipmunk thing throughout Talis'
Yeah.
conversation with Maxine. Like, seriously, I mean, I can't imagine any other doing that. That stupid and self-indulgent of a use of essentially stream of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But also, it's just hilarious in a way that is deeply, deeply pinching. Just, yeah, I mean, you're going to have this like hard-boiled detective scene where the PI is facing down the femme fatale, and in the PI's head is just me, I wanna hula hoop. It's wonderful.
And then, like, after a half a page, or like maybe in a full page, it comes back and she's thinking of Alvin.
Yep. Like almost. I mean, it's almost a full 2 pages later.
Yeah,
it's a pretty good timing bit.
When it came up this time when I was reading it, I'd forgotten about the previous joke, and I was super confused. Well, that will pretty much wrap us up for this episode of Mapping the Zone. Thank you, as always, for listening. We talked about a lot of different things this week, so it'll all be in the description as usual for you to continue to do some of your own research or your own further reading or watching or listening to other stuff that we had mentioned. We are going to be taking a break next week, right, Cody?
No, next week we're doing chapters 13 through 15, and then we're doing a break.
Okay. Yeah, so we are going to be doing 13, 14, and 15 next week, and then we'll be off for a week before we come back and do 16, 17, and 18. Feel free, as always, to reach out to us on any of our socials. We are on Twitter at twitter.com/pinchonpod. We are on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Podcast, and our email, if you want to send us anything. If there's any fellow Zima fans out there, love to hear from you. Maybe we can get an importing company going to get this stuff back to the States. You can email us at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. As always, thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week. Thank you.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.